They thought he was just a blind man with a dog. The bikers laughed, mocked, and pushed, convinced silence meant weakness. But what they didn't know was that Ethan Cross was no ordinary man, and Val was no ordinary dog. In one quiet command, years of battlefield discipline turned the room upside down. By the time it was over, the bikers weren't laughing. They were running. What did this service dog do that left an entire town stunned into silence? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The morning was quiet in the small Vermont town, the kind of quiet that made every sound carry further than it should. Tires crunching over gravel, a screen door slamming shut, the faint hum of an old neon sign buzzing outside the diner that had been open since before most people could remember. Against that stillness came the steady rhythm of a cane striking the sidewalk, measured and deliberate, accompanied by the soft pad of paws that seemed to anticipate each step before it was taken. Ethan Cross walked with a posture that had once been proud and unbroken, but now bore the weight of years lived in silence. His sunglasses had eyes that no longer worked, but there was no hesitation in his stride. Beside him, the German shepherd moved like an extension of his body, scanning the ground ahead, muscles taut, head lifted. Every detail of its training evident in the way it adjusted to cracks in the pavement or the unexpected rattle of a truck down the street. People noticed when Ethan passed. They always did. Some looked away out of discomfort, uncertain whether to offer help or let him be. Others nodded quietly, a mark of respect that came from knowing his story, even if only in fragments. The veteran who had come back from overseas with more scars than most could carry, the man who had lost his sight but refused to disappear. The dog at his side bore a name that townsfolk still whispered about, Valor, a name earned on battlefields that none of them had ever seen. The air carried the smell of frying bacon and strong coffee from the diner, mingled with the sharpness of gasoline from the pumps across the street. Ethan tapped his way forward, the cane meeting cracked edges of the sidewalk where the town had let repairs fall behind. Each sound was a landmark to him, each echo a piece of the map he carried in his head. Valor slowed when a child ran across the path chasing a ball, then quickened once the way cleared, his body pressing gently against Ethan's leg as a signal. Ethan murmured a word of acknowledgement, almost too soft to hear, and the dog's ears flicked back, reassured. It should have been just another walk into town. It should have been nothing worth remembering. But near the diner, a row of motorcycles lined the curb, chrome catching the pale morning sun, engines cooling from a recent ride. Their owners leaned against a rail outside, leather jackets creaking as they shifted, laughter rising too loud for the stillness of the street. The kind of laughter that was less about joy and more about claiming space, letting everyone know who belonged at the center of attention. They saw Ethan coming long before he reached them, and the first chuckle slipped into the air, sharp enough to draw glances from people inside the diner who were already bracing for what might follow. One of the bikers, a broad man with a shaved head and sunglasses dark enough to mirror Ethan's own, nudged his companion and pointed at the service dog. The words that followed were loud enough for Ethan to hear, even though they weren't meant for him. A joke about a dog leading its blind master, about who was really in control. The group broke into laughter, the sound rolling down the street like a challenge. Ethan didn't change pace. His head remained steady, his expression calm, the only responsive quiet command he gave Valor to continue forward. The German shepherd's tail stayed low, his gaze fixed ahead, but the subtle tightening of his body suggested he understood more than the men realized. Inside the diner, a waitress paused with a coffee pot in her hand, eyes flicking from the bikers to the figure approaching. The regulars at the counter fell into silence, forks suspended over plates. No one spoke, no one moved to interfere. The weight of the moment hung between two worlds, the steady dignity of a man walking with his dog, and the restless energy of men looking for entertainment at someone else's expense. Ethan's cane tapped once more against the sidewalk, louder this time, echoing against the glass windows. Valor guided him directly toward the diner door, unbothered by the laughter, carrying his master forward into whatever waited on the other side. The bikers watched him approach, grins wide, eyes narrowed in the way men look when they sense an opportunity to test someone they don't understand. What they didn't know, what no one yet knew, was that this was not the kind of man or the kind of dog to be tested lightly. This was only the beginning. The first laugh came sharp and cutting, like a stone tossed into still water. It started with one of them, a lanky rider with tattoos running down his arms, who leaned forward from his seat on the diner's rail. "Look at that, boys," he said loud enough for half the street to hear. "A dog walking a man. Guess we've seen everything now." His words carried, and the others picked it up instantly, their laughter echoing across the quiet square. It wasn't laughter born of joy. It was the kind that twisted inward, meant to wound, meant to make sure everyone nearby looked at the same thing and found it ridiculous. Ethan Cross kept his pace steady, his cane tapping with the same deliberate rhythm as before. The sound was unshaken, a measured beat that belonged to a man who had walked through far worse than heckling voices. Valor stayed aligned with his side, each paw a place of precision, his movements synchronized to the subtle shifts in Ethan's posture. The dog's head tilted slightly at the sound of the laughter, ears twitching, but he made no move to break stride. Training held him steady, years of discipline anchoring him against a sudden intrusion. The bikers leaned into the moment, emboldened by their own noise. Another one called out, "Hey, think the muscle brains of this operation? Bet he knows when it's time to cross the street better than his master." The group erupted again, their voices bouncing off the glass windows of the diner. A couple inside looked away from their plates, their hands frozen mid-bite. The waitress at the counter bit her lip, but said nothing, watching the scene unfold through the wide windows. Ethan heard every word. He always did. Years of learning to navigate without sight had honed his hearing into something sharper, more precise than most men could imagine. He could hear the nervous shuffle of a bystander shifting from one foot to the other, the subtle intake of breath from someone unsure whether to step in, and the faint rattle of metal buckles as one of the bikers slapped his jacket in amusement. But none of it showed on his face. His expression remained calm, still, betraying nothing of the quiet storm that settled beneath the surface. Valor responded in his own way. His body pressed closer to Ethan's leg, a signal of heightened awareness, the kind of alertness that only Ethan would recognize. To anyone else, the dog was simply guiding, as he always did. But Ethan felt the tension in the animal's frame, the readiness, the watchful patience. He reached down briefly, fingers brushing the thick fur along Valor's neck, a silent exchange of reassurance. No words were spoken between them, none were needed. The laughter swelled again, as though the bikers were trying to outdo each other in their cruelty. "Careful, old man," one shouted. "That dog looks like he's dragging you straight into a wall." The remark brought another round of jeers. A few teenagers passing by glanced over nervously, unsure whether to keep walking or stop and watch. The square, usually filled with the ordinary sounds of small-town life, seemed to shrink until it contained only the bikers' voices, the tap of Ethan's cane, and the steady beat of Valor's paws on pavement. Still Ethan walked. He did not quicken his steps, did not falter, did not give him the satisfaction of acknowledging their presence. To him, the world had already taught harsher lessons than theirs could ever offer. Mockery was nothing new. What mattered was the ground beneath his feet, the trust in the animal at his side, and the knowledge that dignity was something no laughter could strip away. The bikers expected a flinch, a stumble, maybe even a word of protest to feed their appetite for cruelty. Instead, they found themselves laughing at a man who did not break, a man who refused to give them the reaction they sought. That refusal unsettled them more than they realized. The sound of their laughter grew louder, sharper, as though they needed to convince themselves that they were still in control of the moment. But Ethan's silence pressed against them like a weight, and the steadiness of Valor's gait carried him forward through the storm of noise with a calmness that made the jeers ring hollow. The square watched it happen, the quiet dignity of one man and his dog standing against the raucous noise of a group that mistook cruelty for strength. It was only laughter, but it left behind an unease, as though everyone present understood on some level that this was not the end. Something in the way Valor's ears stayed forward, in the way Ethan's head remained high despite the blindness, promised that the story unfolding on that cracked sidewalk had only just begun. The diner was the kind of place where mornings always carried the same rhythm. The sizzle of bacon on the griddle, the scrape of forks against chipped plates, the steady murmur of locals who had been occupying the same booths for decades. It was a space where everyone knew the names of the waitresses, where the sound of the bell above the door was as familiar as the smell of brewed coffee. On most days, the quiet routine was unbroken, a comfort that everyone relied on. But when the door swung open and the bikers came in behind Ethan Cross, the rhythm faltered like a needle slipping across a record. Ethan had entered first, Valor guiding him through the doorway with the same precision as always, his cane tapping against the tile floor as he found his way to the counter. For a moment, there was nothing unusual. The waitress closest to the door, balancing a tray of pancakes, smiled faintly out of habit, though she quickly turned her eyes away, unwilling to meet the gaze of the men spilling in after him. Their boots hit the floor hard, as though they wanted the entire diner to know they had arrived. The laughter they had carried across the square still clung to them, spilling into the narrow space and filling every corner. The regulars froze. Coffee cups were left halfway to lips. Forks hovered over plates. Conversations ended in the middle of sentences. The noise of the bikers was so loud that the ordinary sounds of the diner, the soft hum of the jukebox, the hiss of eggs frying in the kitchen, seemed suddenly fragile, unable to stand against the roar of their presence. Dogs still leading the way. One of them shouted, loud enough that it rang off the tiled walls. Wonder what happens if the dog gets hungry. Does the man just follow him to the butcher? The others broke into laughter again, their voices heavy, mocking meant for an audience. No one responded. No one ever did when strangers came in with that kind of energy. The silence was its own defense, though it also made the cruelty sharper. Ethan said nothing, only guided himself to her stool at the counter, Valor curling down at his feet with motion so smooth it was almost rehearsed. The dog's eyes never left the men, ears flicking at each burst of noise. The waitresses exchanged glances. Maya, carrying a fresh pot of coffee, stopped near the far booth, her knuckles whitening around the handle. She had known Ethan in another life, before his sight was taken, before the town came to know him as the quiet veteran who walked everywhere with his dog. She knew better than most what silence could mean, but she said nothing. Not yet. The bikers spread themselves out across the diner, not bothering to sit right away. They wanted their presence to be felt, to take up space in a place that had no room for them. One leaned against a jukebox, drumming his fingers against its cracked surface. Another dragged a chair across the floor with deliberate slowness, the scraping sound loud enough to make a child at the window flinch. They were loud, and they wanted the world to shrink around their noise. Ethan reached out for counter, found the edge, and placed his hand calmly on the smooth wood. He didn't speak. He didn't react. The only sound from him was the steady clink of his cane as he rested it against the counter, the faint shuffle of his boots as he adjusted to the stool. Valor's breathing was even, though his gaze burned with a watchfulness that unsettled anyone who dared meet it. The contrast in the room grew heavier with each passing second. The laughter of the bikers was too much for the small space, too forced, as though they were trying to drown out the silence pressing in on them from all sides. The clink of silverware from the table seemed fragile in comparison, each sound magnified by the quiet of those who chose not to answer. There was an unspoken rule in places like that diner. Outsiders might make noise, might try to draw attention, but the regulars would hold their silence. They would watch, they would wait, and they would measure a man by how he chose to respond. And Ethan, with his calm face and steady posture, gave them nothing to feed on. His composure hung heavier than any words could. The waitress behind the counter finally stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked if he wanted the usual. It was a small act, one that cut through the noise like a thread of normalcy. Ethan nodded, his voice soft as he thanked her. An exchange was enough to remind everyone in the room what kind of man he was. The bikers kept laughing, louder now, desperate to reclaim the attention. But the silence of the diner did not shift back into ordinary chatter. It held firm, fragile but steady, the kind of silence that did not belong to fear, but to witness. Something was building, and everyone in that diner could feel it. The men who had come in loud did not realize it yet, but they had already lost something to that silence. It wasn't respect. It was control. Ethan settled onto the stool at the counter with a slow, deliberate movement, as though he had done it 100 times before. His hand traced the edge of the polished wood until he found the right spot, and he rested there, calm and unhurried. Valor folded himself neatly at his feet, the German shepherd's body pressed close enough to touch his master's boots, head resting between his paws, but eyes never leaving the room. The dog's breathing was steady, deep and even, but the muscles along his shoulders carried a tension that only Ethan could sense. The bikers spread out behind him, the scrape of chairs across the tile floor loud and jarring, a deliberate intrusion on the fragile order of the diner. Their boots hit the floor in uneven rhythms, a stomp here, a shuffle there, each one calculated to remind the room of their presence. Ethan did not turn toward them. He could not see the sneers, the curled lips, the smug glances tossed at one another as though cruelty were some kind of performance to be shared. But he needed sight to know what they were doing. The sound of their laughter, the false ease of their voices, and the restless weight of their movements told him enough. He kept his posture straight, his expression quiet, and his hands resting loosely in his lap. It was not defiance, not in any obvious way. It was something subtler, harder to mock. Composure that could not be shaken by noise alone. Years in uniform had taught him that silence could be as heavy as a wall. He had carried that silence into places where panic would have meant death. Now, in a small-town diner filled with the smell of coffee and fried eggs, he wore it again like armor. The bystanders shifted in their seats, forks clinking nervously against plates, coffee cups resting untouched in their saucers. No one spoke. They did not want to draw attention, did not want to break the strange balance between the man at the counter and the men filling the room with their noise. Some watched Ethan with cautious eyes, waiting for him to react, waiting for some sign that he was shaken. Others avoided looking at all, their heads bent low, pretending to focus on their food. Maya, the waitress nearest him, placed a cup of coffee in front of him with careful precision. Her hand lingered for just a moment on the counter, as though she wished she could say more, but Ethan gave only a quiet nod in thanks. That was enough. She stepped back, eyes flicking toward the bikers who had taken over a corner booth and were watching with a restless kind of hunger, waiting for the smallest crack in his composure. But there was none. Ethan's stillness filled the space more than their noise did. He listened to everything. The tap of a spoon against glass, the squeak of leather jackets as they shifted, the low murmur of someone at the far table whispering nervously. He could map the entire room in his head, without turning his face once. That knowledge steadied him, gave him a presence that no laughter could erase. The bikers tried harder. A boot slammed against the leg of a chair, sending it screeching across the tile. The noise cut sharp through the air, but Ethan did not flinch. Valor's ears twitched, and for a heartbeat the German shepherd lifted his head, eyes narrowing, but at a subtle touch of Ethan's hand. The dog lowered it again, resuming his position of watchful calm. The silence that followed was heavier than the laughter had been. The regulars could feel it pressing down, making the bikers' attempt seem louder, clumsier, less natural. What had started as amusement now felt forced, as though they were laughing only to fill the void that Ethan refused to let them own. His calmness, his refusal to bend to their noise, unsettled them in ways they did not admit. And for the people in the diner, the farmers, the truck drivers, the elderly couple by the window, the silence became something else. It became respect. They were not watching a man being mocked. They were watching a man who would not break, a man whose quiet steadiness made the noise around him seem small. Ethan lifted the cup to his lips and took a slow sip of coffee. The simple act was enough to remind the room that he was not rattled, not moved from the place he had claimed at the counter. He had walked through worse storms than this. He had stood in places where laughter was replaced with gunfire and silence meant survival. Compared to that, the voices behind him were little more than echoes. The bikers laughed again, but this time the sound didn't carry the same weight. It fell flat, landing in a room that no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the silence, and to the blind man who commanded it without ever needing to raise his voice. Valor lay close to Ethan's boots, his body curled in a posture that looked relaxed to casual eye, but every inch of him was wound with purpose. The German shepherd's coat caught the thin light spilling in from the diner's front windows, each movement of muscle beneath his fur smooth and deliberate. His eyes never wavered. They were locked on the men across the room, pupils narrowing and widening with each shift of their weight, with each scrape of a chair leg against the floor. Ethan couldn't see it, but he didn't have to. He knew the feel of his dog's tension, the subtle way Valor pressed just slightly closer to his shin, the faint tremor of restrained energy running through the animal's body. The bikers mistook that stillness for passivity. They laughed louder, clapping one another on the shoulders, making jokes about a blind man's dependence on a mutt. One tossed a crumpled napkin toward the floor near Valor, as if to tempt him into movement. The dog's ears twitched, catching the sound of the paper as it fluttered down, but his eyes never left theirs. He did not move for the bait. His training ran deeper than any instinct to chase or play. That refusal unsettled a few of the quieter onlookers. They could see what the bikers could not, that there was nothing ordinary about the way Valor held a room in his gaze. His ears flicked toward the sound of boots hitting tile, then forward again, recalibrating with each new noise. Every laugh, every cough, every heavy breath from the men in leather was registered and weighed. He tracked their movements the way a soldier watches a battlefield, mapping exits, measuring distances, anticipating where danger might come from. His body remained low, but his chest rose and fell with a rhythm that carried the calm steadiness of training forged over years. Ethan's hand rested lightly on the counter, his face impassive, but his awareness was tethered to the dog at his feet. He didn't need eyes to know Valor's state. He could sense the tension in the leash slack, feel the way the animal leaned just enough to guard his left side, hear the faint click of claws against the tile whenever someone drew too close. The bond between them was more than habit. It was the kind of connection born out of necessity, of trust tested under circumstances no one else in the diner could imagine. The room itself seemed to feel it. Conversation stayed hushed. Silverware rested against plates, and the jukebox's low hum became a background note to the silent standoff. The bikers' laughter tried to fill the space, but it landed shallow against the heavy air created by one dog's focus. Those steady eyes carried a weight that stripped their jeers of authority. It was not defiance, not aggression, but a level of alertness that reminded anyone watching that this animal was no pet brought along for comfort. He was working, and his work was to protect. One of the bikers noticed it at last. He smirked at first, then frowned slightly when Valor did not glance away. When the dog's gaze tracked him with unbroken precision, the man shifted in his seat restless, and the dog's head followed the movement smoothly, unhurried, as though marking him. The laughter dimmed just for a moment, a flicker of unease surfacing beneath their bravado. Valor's tail didn't wag. His ears didn't flop in any gesture of friendliness. Instead, every angle of his body broadcast readiness, a soldier awaiting orders, muscles alive beneath the stillness. To those who knew what to look for, the sight was unmistakable. The dog was not intimidated, not confused. He was prepared. That preparation filled the room more powerfully than any words Ethan might have spoken. The regulars noticed it. Maya, standing behind the counter with the coffee pot still in her hand, felt her throat tighten at the sight. She had seen dogs like that once before, overseas, and she knew the line between calm obedience and explosive action was thinner than most people realized. Valor wasn't threatening, but he was a presence, steady and immovable. His eyes carried the promise that if the balance shifted, if Ethan was touched or threatened, the stillness would end in an instant, and so the silence deepened. The bikers kept talking, but the edge had dulled, their noise trying too hard to mask the discomfort gnawing at the corners of their confidence. They were being watched, weighed, measured by a creature whose loyalty allowed no compromise. Valor did not blink. He did not waver. In his eyes burned the kind of clarity that only came from a lifetime of training, from battles fought in shadows, from an unbroken bond with a man at the counter who trusted him without hesitation. Ethan sat with quiet composure, blind to the stares, but anchored by the certainty at his feet. Valor's steady eyes did the speaking for him, and the message was one the entire diner understood. The man might not see, but the dog saw enough for both of them. Rex made his move with the swagger of someone who believed every eye in the room was already on him. His boot struck the tile with deliberate force, each step a declaration meant to remind everyone who held the floor. The laughter of his crew followed close behind, filling the diner with a noise that was too loud, too forced, as though they needed to feed on each other's bravado. He stopped just short of Ethan, his shadow falling across the counter, and leaned in far enough that the smell of leather and stale tobacco clung in the air. "Bet that much sees better than you ever could," he sneered, his voice carrying the sharp edge of cruelty disguised as humor. The words drew another burst of laughter from the men in the booth, who slapped the table and barked their approval. It wasn't just a joke anymore. It was performance, and the leader's taunt set the stage. Ethan didn't turn toward him. His face remained calm, expression unreadable, as if the insult hadn't landed at all. He lifted his coffee cup with steady hands, took a slow sip, and set it back down with precision that made the silence stretch. The lack of reaction stung more than any argument could have. Rex's grin faltered for a moment, though he quickly replaced it with a louder laugh, trying to cover the flicker of unease. Valor shifted at Ethan's feet, his body pressing closer to his master's leg, his ears angled forward, and his gaze sharpened on the man looming over them. The dog didn't growl, didn't bare his teeth, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. Those who knew how to read animals, Maya at the counter, the older farmer by the window, could see the warning written in every line of his frame. Valor wasn't afraid. He was calculating. Rex reached down suddenly, snapping his fingers near the dog's face. "Hey, soldier," he mocked. "What's it like having to babysit the blind?" His tone dripped with a mixture of contempt and challenge, daring the animal to react. The laughter rose again from a booth, one of them whistling, another pounding his fist against the table for emphasis. Still, Ethan didn't move, his head tilted slightly, as though he were listening to something no one else could hear. The rhythm of boots behind him, the scrape of jackets shifting in leather seats, the nervous call from someone in the back of the diner who wanted the scene to end. His silence was a kind of defiance, a refusal to bend to the noise pressing in on him. The other bikers grew bolder, emboldened by Rex's lead. One called out, "Careful, Rex. Dog might be the smart one in that pair." Another added, "Yeah, watch it doesn't lead him straight into traffic." Their voices overlapped, cruel in their effort to outdo one another, their jeers gaining a hollow momentum that made the walls of the diner feel too close. Valor's tail lowered, his muscles taut as a coiled spring. His eyes never left Rex, tracking the man's every twitch with surgical precision. For a heartbeat, the laughter faltered as the weight of that gaze settled on the room. Then Rex barked another laugh, louder than before, determined not to let silence claim the moment. He slapped the counter near Ethan's arm, the sound sharp and sudden, but Ethan didn't flinch. He sat unmoving, shoulders square, his hands resting steady. The waitress at the far end of the counter tightened her grip on the coffee pot she still held, her knuckles whitening. The elderly couple near the window exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. The diner had fallen into the kind of tension that made every sound sharper, every movement heavier. Rex leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough that only those nearest could hear. "You think sitting there quiet makes you strong? You're nothing without that dog." He jerked his chin toward Valor, but the animal's stillness didn't waver. The German shepherd's eyes stayed locked on him, a silent counterargument to every word. The laughter resumed, but it carried a strain now. A sense of performance was starting to crack around the edges. Ethan's refusal to react, Valor's unflinching gaze. Together they created a wall that noise couldn't penetrate. The bikers didn't see it yet, not fully, but the people watching did. The silence wasn't weakness. It was power, steady and unshaken, waiting for the right moment to show itself. Rex straightened at last, forcing another laugh as he returned to his crew. But his steps were heavier than before, his movements less certain. The jeers continued, echoing off the walls of the small diner, but the air had changed. Something unseen had shifted, and the balance of the room no longer tilted as easily in the bikers' favor. The man at the counter had given them nothing, and the dog at his feet had given them more than they knew how to handle. Maya had been watching the scene unfold with the kind of tight focus that came from memory as much as from instinct. She knew Ethan Cross long before he became the quiet man who walked Main Street with a service dog. Years earlier, in a desert that felt like another lifetime, she had knelt in the dust with her medic's kit, patching up wounds under fire while Ethan barked orders that steadied men on the edge of panic. She remembered his voice carrying over the chaos, calm and steady, the same tone he now used in silence. Seeing him mocked by men who had never carried more than the weight of their own arrogance stirred something deep inside her. She set down the coffee pot she'd been holding and moved closer, her sneakers squeaking softly against the tile floor. Her presence alone shifted the attention of a few of the regulars, who had been waiting for someone to do what they didn't dare. The bikers, though, were too absorbed in their own performance to notice until she spoke. "Enough," she said, her voice sharp but not raised. It cut through the forced laughter like a knife, making the diner's stillness even heavier. "Do you even know who you're talking to?" Rex turned toward her, his smirk already forming before she had finished. "Yeah, we know," he drawled. "Some blind guy with a fancy mutt. Looks like the mutt's got more backbone than he does." His words brought another round of chuckles from his men, but the sound had less strength now, less conviction. Maya didn't flinch. She planted herself near the counter, close enough that her hand almost brushed Ethan's shoulder, though she didn't touch him. Her eyes stayed locked on Rex. "He's a veteran," she said firmly. "He's seen more in his life than you ever will. That dog at his feet isn't just a pet. He was trained for service. Both of them have faced things you wouldn't survive a day in." The words carried weight for people who knew her. Some of the regulars shifted in their seats, nodding faintly, their eyes flicking toward Ethan with recognition that hadn't been voiced until now. But the bikers weren't interested in respect. They wanted the opposite. Rex snorted, leaning back as if the very idea amused him. "A veteran? Huh? That's supposed to mean something to me?" He looked back at his crew, spreading his arms wide as though he'd just been handed a punchline. "Guess we're supposed to bow our heads and whisper thanks, right? Maybe buy him a drink for all his hard work." The men in the booth laughed again, louder this time, feeding off a sneer. Maya's jaw tightened, but she didn't back down. "It means you don't get to sit here and treat him like he's nothing," she shot back. "You don't get to mock what you don't understand." One of the bikers near the jukebox tilted his head and grinned. "Sounds like somebody's sweet on him," he said, his voice slick and cruel. The others roared with laughter again, the sound spilling over into the diner until it felt like the walls themselves shook with it. Ethan sat still through it all, his hands resting loosely in his lap, his head tilted just slightly in Maya's direction, as though he were listening to her more than the men. Valor remained a statue at his feet, only the flick of his ears betraying how closely he was tracking each voice. The sneers rolled on. "Veteran or not, he's just another guy leaning on a leash," Rex muttered, his smile hardening. "And you," he jabbed a finger in Maya's direction, "ought to mind your own business. This doesn't concern you." But it did concern her. Every word thrown at Ethan seemed to echo against memories she had carried home, memories of men bleeding and broken, of nights spent in field tents trying to keep them alive. Ethan had been there in those moments, unyielding, steady, the kind of man who held others together when they were falling apart. And now here he was, treated like nothing by men who had no idea what he'd given up. Maya stood her ground, though her voice softened when she spoke again. "It concerns me," she said, "because I know what he's worth. And if you had the slightest sense, you'd know it too." The bikers only laughed harder, their sneers louder, but in their eyes there was the faintest flicker of something else. For all their bravado, Maya's words had planted a splinter. The regulars in the diner no longer looked at Ethan with pity, but with the beginnings of respect, a respect the bikers could not control or mock away. Ethan lifted his coffee cup again, his hand steady, and Valor's gaze never broke from the men across the room. Silence stretched between the laughter and the clink of his cup on the counter, a silence that unsettled even the boldest voices. The bikers brushed Maya off, but her words lingered, hanging in the air heavier than their jeers. Something had shifted, and though they pretended not to feel it, everyone else in the diner knew it was there. The laughter had gone on long enough that it felt like part of the air in the diner, a steady drone that pressed down on everyone who sat there in silence. The bikers thrived on it, feeding off each other's cruelty, their noise bouncing between the walls until it seemed like the room itself was cornered. Ethan remained at the counter, calm, steady, sipping his coffee as though nothing around him had any power to reach him. Valor was still at his feet, a quiet sentinel, his eyes trained on every movement in the room. But it only took one man's decision to push the moment from jeering words into something far uglier. One of the bikers rose from his seat with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. His boots hit the tile in heavy steps as he strolled past Ethan's stool, his hand dragging across the counter as if claiming the space as his own. Then, without breaking stride, he lashed out with his foot. The cane that had been resting carefully against the counter clattered to the floor, the sound loud and sharp, metal striking tile. The jolt knocked Ethan's balance just enough that his elbow caught his coffee cup, sending it toppling across the counter. The hot liquid spilled over the edge, splattering against his shirt and dripping onto the floor. The entire diner froze. The laughter that had been so constant died all at once, leaving behind only the hiss of grease in the kitchen and the faint crackle of the neon sign outside. Forks rested in midair. The waitress by the pie case held her breath. Even the jukebox seemed quieter, its low hum almost swallowed by the sudden weight of silence. It wasn't just the act itself that struck them. It was the deliberate cruelty of it. The way the biker had looked at Ethan's cane before sending it flying, the intent to humiliate clear in every motion. Ethan's hand tightened slightly on the edge of the counter. He didn't flinch at the heat of the coffee or the sting of humiliation. Instead, he breathed in once, slow and even, as though anchoring himself in the silence that had fallen over the room. His head tilted slightly, as if he were listening to the exact place where his cane had landed. He did not speak. He did not curse. He simply sat still, a calmness radiating from him that unsettled the very men who had wanted to see him falter. Valor moved. Not suddenly, not with aggression, but with a deliberate grace that drew every eye. The German shepherd rose from his position at Ethan's feet, his body unfolding with the controlled power of an animal trained for precision. His eyes locked on the biker who had delivered the kick, and his stance shifted forward just enough that the man felt the change. The dog did not growl. He didn't need to. His body spoke more loudly than any sound could. The message was clear. Another step, and the ground would not be yours anymore. The biker smirked at first, tried to shrug off the unease with a chuckle. "Relax, it was just an accident," he said, though his voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. But no one in the diner believed it. They had seen the angle of the kick, the deliberate cruelty in his eyes. They had heard the sound of the cane striking the tile with intent. Maya, still behind the counter, was the first to move. She grabbed a rag and stepped toward Ethan quickly, her eyes burning at the biker as she dabbed at the spilled coffee. "You don't get to call that an accident," she muttered, her voice low but sharp. The biker's smirk faltered, and he looked away, trying to shrug it off, but the silence around him was heavier than anything he could laugh through. The regulars watched without speaking, their eyes fixed on Ethan and Valor. No one reached for the cane on the floor, as if waiting to see what Ethan himself would do. Ethan finally moved, lifting his hand slightly, his fingers brushing the air in the direction of his dog. Valor responded instantly, turning from the biker to the cane. He patted across the floor, picked it up gently in his mouth, and brought it back to rest against Ethan's hand. The precision of the act, the seamless way man and dog moved together, filled the silence with something deeper than words, dignity that not even humiliation could take away. The biker who had delivered the kick shifted uneasily, his bravado slipping. His friends tried to laugh again, but the sound was thin now, brittle, cracking under the weight of what the room had just witnessed. Ethan placed the cane back where it belonged, his hand steady. The coffee stain spread slowly across his shirt, but he didn't reach for a napkin. He sat tall, unbroken, the silence thick around him. The moment that had been meant to humiliate had become something else entirely, a turning point that every person in the diner would remember. The laughter had been silenced, and in its place lingered a heavy awareness. The blind man was not the vulnerable one in the room. The ones who had tried to mock him were. The clatter of the cane still echoed faintly when Valor rose on the floor, his movements fluid and precise, like a machine made of flesh and muscle. One moment he was lying at Ethan's feet, the picture of composure, and the next his frame was towering over the space between his master and the biker who had knocked the cane aside. His body formed a wall, firm and immovable, his chest out, his stance squared, his gaze fixed on the man who had caused the spill. The dog made no sound. He didn't bark or lunge. But the simple act of rising shifted the air in the diner, so sharply that everyone inside felt it. The biker who had thrown the kick froze, his grin faltering as those dark eyes locked onto him. There was no mistaking it. The dog wasn't confused or startled. He was alert deliberate, carrying himself with the kind of authority that didn't need teeth bare to be understood. For a moment, the diner was silent, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then laughter broke out again, but it didn't sound the same. It was thinner now, brittle at the edges, filled with a nervous energy. One of the bikers at the booth slapped the table and tried to grin wider than he felt. "Look at that. He's putting on a show," he called out. "Trained to do tricks. Stand up when someone spills a drink. Cute." The others followed, laughing too loudly, their voices bouncing off the walls in an effort to drown out what their eyes couldn't ignore. But their laughter couldn't mask the way they leaned back slightly in their seats, couldn't hide the unease and the way their eyes flicked between Valor and Ethan. Valor didn't so much as blink, his ears angled forward, reading every sound, every shuffle of boots. The faint twitch of muscle along his shoulders spoke volumes to those who knew how to read it. He wasn't performing. He was calculating. He was a barrier, a sentinel, his focus sharpened to a single point, protecting the man at the counter. Ethan reached down slowly, his fingers brushing the thick fur along Valor's neck. It wasn't a command. It wasn't even reassurance. It was a connection, a reminder that the two of them moved as one. Ethan's face remained calm, his posture steady, but the room felt the weight of that touch. It was the anchor between silence and storm. The biker who had caused the spill tried to shake it off. "Relax," he muttered, forcing a laugh as he raised his hands in mock surrender. Just a dog doing his job. His voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments before, and the crack in his bravado spread quickly among his crew. Maya, standing behind the counter, didn't move. She had seen that stance before, not in diners, but in places where dust and fire made every second a gamble. She knew the difference between a pet and a partner, between an animal reacting and an animal trained to hold a line. Valor wasn't showing off. He was working. The regulars in the diner felt it too. Their silence was no longer just fear of the biker's noise. It was respect, an instinctive recognition that something important was happening in front of them. Some lowered their eyes, not wanting to challenge the dog's gaze even from across the room. Others stared openly, caught in the gravity of the moment. The laughter of the bikers continued, but it sounded more and more like an echo, hollow and forced. They called it an act, mocked the stillness, but their bodies betrayed them. Shoulders hunched, feet shifted, eyes darted toward the door, as if calculating how quickly they could leave if the act stopped being an act. Valor remained motionless, a shadow of strength at Ethan's side. His body was ready without aggression, his presence a quiet warning that could not be laughed away. And Ethan, blind though he was, carried himself as if he could see every detail through his dog's steady eyes. The energy in the room had changed, and even those who pretended not to feel it knew deep down that nothing would go back to the way it was before the dog had risen. It was a kind of silence that carried weight, stretched tight across the small diner, the kind that made every sound sharper, every breath heavier. Valor stood firm, his body drawn tall, his eyes fixed on the bikers who were trying too hard to laugh off the tension. Ethan's hand rested lightly on the counter, his fingers steady, his face composed, though he felt the shift in the room as clearly as anyone who could see. It wasn't just about spilled coffee anymore. Something deeper had begun to settle into the air. From the back corner, an older man leaned forward in his booth, his hat tilted low over weathered eyes. He had been sitting quiet through the commotion, chewing his breakfast with the slow patience of someone who had seen more years than most. His voice, when it came, was almost a whisper, meant more for himself than anyone else. Yet the stillness made it carry. "I've seen that dog before," he muttered. A few heads turned, uncertain if they'd heard right. The man straightened slightly, his gaze narrowing on the German shepherd's unflinching posture. "Not here," he went on, his voice firmer now. "Overseas. In one of those clips they showed on the news. 8 K9 unit. Same build, same eyes. Dog like that doesn't just come from a pet store." The words rippled outward, carried from table to table in hushed exchanges. One woman leaned toward her husband, whispering the rumor into his ear. A teenager near the window pulled out his phone as if to confirm, recalling shaky footage he'd once seen online of soldiers and their dogs navigating streets filled with dust and fire. Each whisper added weight, each repetition giving the idea more form. Maya froze where she stood, coffee pot in hand, her throat tightening. She didn't need confirmation. She remembered. She had seen Ethan with that very dog when she was stationed overseas. Remembered the way Valor moved through chaos with a calm that steadied the men around him. The realization that the others were beginning to piece it together filled her with a strange mixture of pride and dread. The bikers heard the murmurs too. At first they ignored them, waving the words away with dismissive smirks. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew, layer by layer, until the laughter of the crew no longer dominated the room. Their jeers sounded thinner now, swallowed by the quiet conversations threading through the crowd. "That's him," someone said softly. "The one who pulled soldiers out after blasts." Another voice added, "I saw it. Dog took a bullet once, didn't flinch." Rex shifted in his seat, his smirk straining at the edges. He slammed his palm against the table, trying to draw attention back. "Stories," he scoffed, his voice louder than necessary. "Fairy tales to make a mutt look like a hero." But the unease in his eyes betrayed the doubt worming its way into him. He could hear it too, the respect building in the silence, the weight of recognition that no amount of sneering could erase. Valor didn't move. His stance remained the same, unshaken, his gaze a steady line of fire cutting through the room. If the dog knew he was being recognized, he gave no sign. But the whispers grew until they filled every corner, reshaping the air itself. This wasn't just a blind man with a dog anymore. This was something greater. Ethan sat quietly listening. He could not see the ripples spreading across the faces around him, but he felt it in the way the room shifted, the way breaths changed, the way silence carried not pity but awe. He remained still, calm as ever, his fingers brushing the smooth surface of his cane. Valor was no longer just his eyes. He was a legend stepping into memory, a presence that reminded the crowd of battles fought far from their small town, of sacrifice and loyalty most of them could only imagine. The bikers tried to hold their ground, their laughter louder, harsher, but their noise sounded empty now. It could not smother the whispers of recognition weaving through the diner. And though Ethan gave nothing away, his silence spoke as loudly as the murmurs around him. Something irreversible had taken hold, and the men who had mocked him no longer stood on the same ground they had when they walked in. The balance was shifting, one quiet whisper at a time. Rex was never one to let silence settle, without trying to break it. The whispers weaving through the diner made him restless, pricking at his pride like needles. He had walked in expecting the town to shrink beneath his voice, expecting the blind man at the counter to fold under mockery. Instead, the room had shifted against him, pulled by murmurs of recognition and the unflinching stillness of the German shepherd that stood between them. That kind of attention, that kind of respect gathering around someone else, made him burn. He wasn't about to let it stay there. He pushed himself up from his chair, the leather of his vest creaking as he rolled his shoulders back, and swaggered toward the counter. His boots struck the tile with a heavy, uneven rhythm meant to draw every eye in the room. The laughter from his crew followed him, though thinner now, carrying more obligation than joy. Rex came to a stop just inches from Ethan, bending low enough that his breath brushed the air between them. "Hey, mutt," he said, snapping his fingers sharply near Valor's face. The sound cracked like a whip, twice in quick succession, designed to startle. "You paying attention? Or do you just sit there looking pretty?" Valor didn't flinch. His eyes tracked Rex's hand, his head shifting with deliberate precision, his body steady, tail low but firm. He didn't growl. He didn't break posture. The discipline in his training was absolute, but his muscles tightened, a visible coil of potential energy, as though he could launch into motion in less than a heartbeat if the command came. The diner held its breath again. Everyone knew the line had been crossed. Even those who didn't understand the rules of service dogs could sense the wrongness of the act. Ethan sat tall, silent for a moment, his face composed as though weighing the sound of fingers snapping near his partner's head against every insult that had come before. Then his voice came, low, steady, and sharper than any raised shout. "Don't touch the dog." The words were precise, every syllable clipped, carrying the weight of command drilled into him from years of giving orders. It was not a plea. It was a warning. Rex smirked, snapping his fingers again, slower this time, taunting. "What's he gonna do, huh? Bite me? He even know how." His crew laughed behind him, though the sound was uncertain, as if they weren't sure they wanted to keep going. The steady gaze of Valor unsettled them more than they wanted to admit. Ethan turned his head slightly toward the sound of Rex's breath, as if he could see him clearly. His expression didn't change, but his words came again, this time with a quiet finality that filled the entire diner. He doesn't bite unless I tell him to. But if you keep your hands where they don't belong, you won't like what comes next. The air thickened, heavy with the certainty behind his tone. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room could feel that he wasn't bluffing. Valor's discipline, his unwavering stare, made it clear that this wasn't about threats. It was about boundaries, and Rex was standing on the edge of one. For a moment, Rex hesitated, his smirk faltering as the silence pressed in again. He tried to shrug it off, straightening and forcing a laugh. "Relax, old man. Just having some fun," he said, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. He stepped back half a pace, and though he spun toward his crew with a grin, his eyes darted back to the dog, wary despite himself. Valor eased only slightly, lowering his head but keeping his gaze locked, unbroken, his body still a shield between Ethan and the threat. Ethan reached down and brushed his hand against the thick fur at his neck. The contact both reassurance and command. The bond between them was evident, a silent understanding that neither the bikers nor the bystanders could ignore. The crew tried to recover the mood, laughter picking up again, but it was weaker, stripped of its earlier arrogance. They watched their leader snap his fingers in mockery and received nothing but steady defiance in return, from both man and dog. The strength wasn't loud, wasn't showy, but it was undeniable. The regulars in the diner exchanged quiet glances. They had seen the balance tilt again, the power slipping from noise to silence. Ethan's calm voice had cut sharper than any outburst could have, and Valor's steady eyes had done the rest. The bikers didn't know it yet, not fully, but they had been measured and found wanting. The room no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the blind man, and the dog they thought they could mock without consequence. The bikers, restless now that their leader's taunts had not landed the way they hoped, searched for some new way to assert control. Their laughter had grown strained, and the silence of the diner pressed heavier with each second that passed. One of them, a wiry man with a patchy beard and a snake tattoo curling around his neck, reached for the basket of fries that had been sitting half-eaten at his table. He scooped a greasy handful and tossed a piece onto the floor near Valor, the scraps skidding across the tile with a faint squeak. The room watched to see what the dog would do. Most animals would have snapped it up instantly, unable to resist the smell of salt and oil. But Valor didn't so much as flick an ear toward it. His eyes stayed locked on the man, his body still a stone, as though the food weren't even there. His discipline was complete, a refusal so sharp it carried its own kind of defiance. The farmer by the window let out a low whistle, almost inaudible, but enough to mark his astonishment. Another biker, eager to reclaim the moment, leaned down from his seat and dropped the scrap of meat directly in front of Valor's paws. The piece landed inches from his nose. The dog didn't move. He didn't sniff, didn't shift, didn't acknowledge it. His focus remained unbroken, his attention tethered entirely to Ethan's quiet presence at the counter. The silence stretched until the sound of the meat hitting the tile felt louder than any of the laughter that had come before. Ethan's hand rested loosely on the counter, his face impassive, but he knew exactly what was happening. He could feel the tension in Valor's body, could hear the faint sound of food hitting the floor, could sense the expectation radiating from the bikers. He gave no command, no gesture, nothing to break the rhythm of his calm. And so Valor stayed exactly as he was, a sentinel ignoring every provocation. The bikers tried again, this time with louder voices, laughing as they threw another piece of food, then another. Each scrap was ignored, left to gather in a small circle around the dog who never bent to temptation. Their laughter rang hollow now, each attempt to mock undermined by the growing awareness that the animal they were trying to reduce to a joke was proving himself stronger than any of them. "Must be broken," one of them muttered, though the words lacked conviction. His smirk faltered when Valor's eyes lifted to him directly, unblinking, unwavering, as though he had seen through the taunt. The biker shifted in his seat, looking away quickly, but the unease clung to him all the same. Maya stepped closer, her arms crossed, her voice low but firm. "That dog's not broken. He's trained, better trained than any of you will ever understand." Her words carried, cutting through the forced laughter. No one contradicted her. Valor's refusal to move without command unsettled the room far more than if he had reacted. Obedience at that level wasn't just impressive. It was intimidating. It meant control. It meant the animal could unleash force only when ordered. And that thought weighed heavily on men who thrived on chaos and noise. Ethan finally reached down, brushing his fingers along Valor's neck. The dog's ears flicked back in acknowledgement, but he didn't move. Only when Ethan whispered a single word, soft and measured, did Valor lower his head again, his breathing steady, his posture returned to calm readiness. The scraps of food remained untouched, forgotten by the very animal they had been thrown to tempt. The regulars in the diner shifted, their respect growing in the silence. They saw what the bikers didn't want to admit, that the bond between man and dog was unshakable, a living display of trust and discipline that no mockery could diminish. The bikers' laughter died out slowly, their noise collapsing under the weight of what they had just witnessed. They had tried to provoke, to tempt, to humiliate, but all they had done was reveal the strength of the bond they couldn't understand. And in that silence, heavy and unbroken, it was clear that the blind man and his dog were not the ones being tested. It was the men who mocked them who had been measured and found lacking. The tension in the diner had reached a point where every movement seemed exaggerated, every sound stretched too thin. The scraps of food still lay untouched around Valor's paws, the greasy reminders of a failed attempt at mockery. The bikers had grown restless, their laughter dulled and uncertain, their confidence fraying under the weight of silence they couldn't pierce. That was when one of them decided to push further, to test a line in a way that words and scraps couldn't. He rose from his seat with an affected stretch, his leather jacket creaking as he swung his arms wide. His boots carried him across the floor with a casual gait, but his eyes were fixed on Ethan sitting quietly at the counter. The blind man hadn't moved except to sip his coffee, hadn't reacted to jeers or insults, and that composure had begun to irritate them more than any show of anger might have. To men like him, silence was provocation enough. As he passed, his shoulder accidentally brushed hard against Ethan's, a shove masked his clumsiness. The contact jolted Ethan slightly against the counter, his hand sliding across the polished surface until he found his balance again. The man muttered a sarcastic sorry, loud enough for his friends to hear, his smirk curling as he kept walking. The crew at the booth burst into laughter once more, trying to reclaim the rhythm they had been losing. They hadn't accounted for Valor. The German shepherd moved instantly, no hesitation, no wasted motion. He rose from his calm position and stepped forward, his body sliding between Ethan and the biker with a precision that looked more like choreography than instinct. His chest squared, shoulders tight, head high. He positioned himself as a living wall, blocking any further intrusion. His eyes locked on the man who had delivered the shove, and though he made no sound, the message was unmistakable. The biker froze mid-step. He hadn't expected the dog to react so quickly, so smoothly. He tried to laugh it off, looking down at Valor with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Easy there, boy," he muttered, lifting his hand slightly as though to prove he meant no harm. But the way his feet shifted backward betrayed the nervous energy building beneath his grin. Ethan sat still, his hand brushing lightly against the dog's back, feeling the tension coil within him. He hadn't spoken, hadn't given a command, but the bond between them meant he didn't need to. Valor knew. He could sense threat in a way no one else could, reading intention through tone, posture, movement. The shove might have been disguised as an accident, but to Valor it was clear enough. The diner fell quiet again, the silence so complete it seemed to ring in the ears. Every eye was fixed on the tableau. The biker held still, trying to pretend control, and the dog unyielding, his body a barrier as solid as stone. The regulars hardly dared to breathe. Even the fry cook had stopped clattering pans in the kitchen, his head poked out just far enough to watch. The biker's friends tried to fill the void with laughter, but it sounded forced, scattered, a noise that only highlighted the unease in the room. "Look at that," one of them called. "The dog thinks he's a bodyguard." The word were meant as a joke, but no one joined in except his own table, and even they didn't sound convinced. Valor didn't move. His gaze stayed locked, steady, unblinking, his stance radiating the kind of discipline that could only come from years of training. He didn't bare his teeth, didn't growl, didn't give a satisfaction of aggression. He simply stood there, immovable, the embodiment of purpose. The restraint was more unsettling than if he had lunged, because it carried the unspoken truth. He could, but he chose not to, unless given the word. Ethan finally adjusted his position at the counter, his voice calm when it came. "Step back," he said, not to his dog, but to the man who had brushed him. The words weren't loud, weren't heated, but they carried a weight that filled the room. The biker's smirk faltered, and after a moment's hesitation, he did just that, muttering something under his breath as he returned to his crew. Valor held his position until Ethan's hand brushed down his back once more, a signal that the moment had passed. Only then did he ease back to his place at Ethan's feet, lying down again with the same controlled grace, as though nothing had happened. But something had happened. The laughter of the bikers had grown thinner, their confidence weaker, and the people in the diner looked at Ethan and Valor with something different now. Not pity, not discomfort, respect. The shove had been meant to humiliate, to draw a reaction that would lower the man and his dog. Instead, it had shown the strength of their bond, the quiet force that could not be shaken. And the room, once filled with noise, now belonged to their silence. The diner seemed frozen in its tension, but in Ethan's mind another scene flickered alive, unbidden and unstoppable, as if the shove against his shoulder had shaken it loose in the place where he kept it buried. He could still smell it, the dust, the smoke, the tang of burning metal carried on desert air. Years had passed, but combat had a way of writing itself so deeply into the body that even silence could pull it back with merciless clarity. He remembered the patrol, the way the heat pressed against his skin under layers of gear, the weight of the rifle in his hands, the sound of boots crunching in rhythm down a broken street. His men were tense that day, their eyes scanning windows that felt too quiet, alleys that felt too still. He had felt it too, that thick silence that always preceded violence. Then came the flash. The explosion was less sound than force. One moment he was walking, steady and alert, and the next the ground rose up to meet him, throwing him backward in a rush of heat and dirt. The world rang with a high, piercing tone that swallowed every other sound. He tried to open his eyes, but saw nothing but white, then black, then nothing at all. The chaos of voices reached him dimly. Shouts, orders, the urgency of medics swarming. He remembered trying to reach for his helmet, his rifle, anything that anchored him, but all he could do was clutch at empty air. And then, the realization that cut deeper than pain itself. The light was gone. Recovery was a blur of hospital rooms, voices layered with sympathy, and the gnawing emptiness of night spent staring at darkness that would never lift. He had lived his whole life by sight, commanding by seeing, leading men by watching, and now the world had shrunk to sound, to touch, to memory. Days bled into each other until time lost meaning. He could hear the shuffle of nurses, the hushed words doctors didn't think he caught, the heavy footsteps of fellow soldiers who came to visit but never knew what to say. Then came the day he first met Valor. He had been in rehab for weeks, sullen, unmoored, convinced that what he had lost had taken everything with it. They led him into a quiet training room with a smell of clean floors mixed with the faint musk of animals. A handler placed a leash in his hand, and a moment later, a warm body pressed against his leg. He remembered the shock of it, the sudden steadiness that came not from his own strength but from something alive beside him. He reached down tentatively, brushing fur thick under his fingers, and the dog leaned into the touch. No words, no judgment, just presence. That first day was clumsy. He stumbled, frustrated, muttering that he couldn't do it, that no animal could change the fact that he was broken. But Valor never faltered. Each time Ethan lost balance, the dog steadied him. Each time Ethan hesitated, Valor leaned just enough to guide him forward. At night, when the nightmares pressed in, Ethan would wake to the sound of steady breathing beside his bed, a reminder that he wasn't navigating the dark alone. It didn't take long for Ethan to realize their bond was more than utility. Valor wasn't there simply to lead him across streets or through hallways. He was there to anchor him to life, to remind him that survival was still possible even when everything had been taken. The trust between them wasn't built on commands alone, but on the quiet knowledge that each relied on the other. For Ethan, blindness had been the end of one world. For Valor, it was the beginning of theirs together. Now, in the diner filled with mocking voices and shifting tension, Ethan sat still while Valor stood guard at his side. The past and the present folded into each other. He didn't need eyes to see what was happening. He could feel in the room, the same way he had felt danger in that street long ago. The bond that had been forged in hospital rooms and training fields was the same bond that held them now. It wasn't service. It wasn't charity. It was survival, then and now. It was the one thing no shove, no laughter, no cruelty could ever touch. The diner's atmosphere had shifted into something fragile and brittle, as if the air itself could shatter with the wrong word. The bikers had spread across their booth and chairs, their voices loud but strained, a chorus of forced laughter that no longer rang with the confidence it once held. Ethan remained at the counter, steady, with Valor stretched between him and the threat, a living wall that drew every eye in the room. The silence of the townsfolk weighed against the noise of the intruders, and though no one spoke loudly, the current of whispered conversation had begun to stir. At a corner table near the window, a farmer leaned toward his wife, his hand covering his mouth as though secrecy mattered in a room already watching. "Should we call the sheriff?" he whispered, his words barely audible but carrying all the same. His wife shook her head, her eyes darting to the bikers. "Not yet," she murmured. "If we move too soon, it'll only make it worse." Their hesitation mirrored the quiet unease spreading through the diner. At the counter, a pair of truckers exchanged low glances, both of them shifting uneasily in their stools. One rubbed at his chin, whispering, "Can't just let this go on." The other leaned closer, replying, "Look at him. He doesn't need us. You see how that dog stands? They're not afraid." They fell silent again, unwilling to be the first to break the invisible barrier of inaction that held the whole room in place. Even the children at the diner understood. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking softly why no one was helping. The mother hushed him quickly, eyes fixed on Ethan and the bikers, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to calm him without drawing attention. It was the unspoken rule of small towns. Outsiders made the noise, but the people who belonged watched, waiting, measuring whether they would need to step in. Maya, still behind the counter, stood stiff with her arms crossed. She glanced toward the old rotary phone hanging near the kitchen door, the one connected directly to the sheriff's office. Her fingers twitched with the urge to reach for it, to end this before it could turn into something worse. But then she looked back at Ethan, saw the calm in his face, the steadiness in his posture, and the iron discipline in Valor's stance. Something in her told her to hold back. He hadn't asked for help. He hadn't lost control. And until he did, she knew the town's role was to wait. The whispers thickened, spreading like ripples. "Should we?" "Not yet." "He's handling it." Each murmured exchange carried both fear and awe. What unsettled the townsfolk more than the bikers' noise was Ethan's silence. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't scrambling. He was holding himself with a dignity that demanded witness, as though this wasn't humiliation but a test. The bikers, though still laughing, felt it too. Their jokes had grown harsher, louder, desperate to pull the room back into their control. Yet their noise no longer drowned out the stillness. It amplified it. The more they barked, the more obvious it became that no one in the diner was laughing with them. They were performing for themselves in a room that had already turned. Ethan's head tilted slightly, listening, the faintest curve of his lips almost resembling a smile. He could hear the whispers. He could sense the weight of the town holding itself in suspension, waiting for a sheriff's badge to appear and take the burden from them. But he didn't need that. He had Valor. He had silence. And that was enough. The room stayed locked in that tension, as though the walls themselves were leaning forward to see what would happen next. No one moved toward the phone. No one stood to leave. Every eye was fixed on the blind man at the counter and the dog who watched in his stead. The town waited, the sheriff's name on their lips. But deep down they all knew they weren't watching a man in need of saving. They were watching a man who had already claimed control, and the moment wasn't theirs to break. The bikers had been growing restless, their confidence slipping with each failed attempt to rattle the blind man and his dog. They had tried laughter. They had tried taunts. They had tried the shove and the spilled coffee. Each time, the response was the same. Silence from Ethan, discipline from Valor. That steadiness unsettled them in ways they didn't want to admit. It left them reaching for something new, something bold enough to tip the balance back in their favor. One of them, a stocky rider with grease-stained fingers and a scar slicing across his cheek, decided to make a spectacle of it. He grabbed a strip of half-eaten steak from his plate, holding it up so the others could see, grinning as though he had discovered the perfect joke. "Watch this," he said, his voice loud enough to cut across the tense quiet. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, the meat swinging between his fingers, dripping grease that spattered faintly against the tile. He crouched near Valor, dangling the food inches from the dog's nose. "Let's see how well-trained you really are," he taunted. "Bet you can't resist this, soldier." His laughter rang out, joined quickly by the others, those thinner now, stretched too tight, desperate to fill the silence. Valor did not move. His ears flicked once at the smell, his chest rose and fell with steady rhythm, but his eyes remained locked on the biker's face, not the meat. His jaw stayed firm, lips closed tight, no sign of temptation crossing his features. The discipline in his posture was absolute. Ethan's head turned slightly, listening, the faint sound of dripping grease enough to tell him what was happening. He set his coffee cup down and spoke with quiet authority, his voice low but sharp, carrying across the diner with unmistakable weight. "Leave him." The words weren't just directed at the biker. They were a command for Valor, a reminder that no trick, no taunt would break the bond between them. The effect was immediate. Valor didn't so much as twitch. The meat dangled closer, brushing the air just above his nose, close enough that any ordinary dog would have snapped it up without hesitation. But Valor stayed stone still, his jaw locked tight, his gaze unbroken. His restraint was sharper than any growl, more powerful than any show of teeth. The room held its breath. Even those who had been whispering before were silent now, their eyes fixed on the dog, who ignored the provocation with a discipline that seemed impossible. Then came the murmur, soft at first, then growing as the all spread from one table to another. "Did you see that?" someone whispered. Not even a flinch. Another voice followed, hushed but reverent. "I've never seen anything like it." The biker laughed again, but his grin was forced. His hand wavered slightly as he pulled the meat back, unsettled by the dog's unblinking defiance. "Guess he's too dumb to know when to take what's offered," he muttered, trying to cover his own discomfort. But his words fell flat in the face of what everyone else had just witnessed. Ethan reached down, his hand brushing Valor's neck in a silent affirmation. "Good," he murmured, just loud enough for the dog to hear. The German shepherd's ears flicked back in acknowledgement, his body easing only slightly before settling again into stillness. The scraps of meat that had been tossed earlier still lay untouched on the floor, and now this fresh piece dangled uselessly in the biker's hand, rejected with refusal more eloquent than any spoken word. The crowd had seen enough to understand. This was no ordinary dog, no trick of training for show. This was obedience born from trust, forged in the kind of trials none of them could imagine. The bikers glanced at one another, their laughter faltering into uneasy silence. They had meant to humiliate, to prove that beneath the discipline was nothing more than an animal driven by hunger. Instead, they had revealed something stronger, something they couldn't laugh away. Valor's stillness had turned the spotlight back on them, exposing their noise for what it was: hollow, desperate, and weak. The murmurs of the townsfolk grew into something heavier than whispers. Respect, awe, even a trace of fear hung in their voices. They knew now that the blind man at the counter was not defenseless, that the animal at his side wasn't there for pity or show. Together, they were a force the bikers couldn't touch, no matter how loud they laughed. The biker tossed the meat back onto his plate with a scowl, retreating a step, but the damage was done. The town had seen, the balance had shifted, and the silence that followed was no longer fear. It was recognition. And in that recognition, the bikers felt their control slipping further away. The cane had been left where it had fallen earlier, lying across the diner's floor like a forgotten thing, a silent reminder of the shove that had sent coffee spilling and laughter rolling. No one had moved to pick it up. It remained there, an object that carried more weight than its simple form should have. The townsfolk kept glancing at it, their eyes caught between the polished wood and the blind man at the counter who hadn't once reached for it since. The bikers left it there on purpose, a quiet insult, a mark of dominance meant to linger. Ethan sat calm, his hand brushing against the smooth surface of the counter, his other resting lightly against Valor's neck. He could feel the tension in the room without needing to see it. The whispers, the murmurs, the way boots shifted uneasily and chairs creaked under the weight of men who didn't quite know where the moment would lead. All of it painted a picture in his mind more vivid than sight could offer. He didn't need eyes to understand the cane had become more than a stick on the ground. It was a symbol now, and it was time to take it back. With the faintest movement of his lips, Ethan gave a command. A single word, quiet, calm, meant only for Valor's ears. The German shepherd rose instantly, his body flowing into motion with the grace of an animal trained not just to move, but to move with purpose. He turned from the counter and began to walk, weaving his way through the maze of tables and chairs with flawless precision. His body angled just enough to avoid the jutting-legged chair, his paws landing softly against the tile, claws clicking only faintly. Diners pulled their feet back quickly, their eyes wide, not daring to interrupt the rhythm of his movement. Every step was measured, every angle exact, as though the dog had already mapped the room in his mind long before the command came. He slipped between two booths where men sat frozen, their coffee cups forgotten, their eyes locked on a working dog gliding past. He didn't hesitate, didn't pause to sniff or acknowledge the scraps of food still scattered on the floor. His focus was absolute, his path unshaken. The cane lay against the far side of the diner, angled awkwardly near the base of the stool. Valor reached it, lowered his head, and picked it up gently in his jaws, gripping it with care, so the wood wasn't marked. He turned smoothly, retracing his steps with the same flawless precision, weaving back through the obstacles as though they weren't there at all. The room held its breath, the silence broken only by the soft tap of the canes and brushing the tile as he carried it. When Valor reached Ethan's side again, he lifted his head and placed the cane neatly into his master's waiting hand. Ethan's fingers closed around a familiar shape, and for the first time since it had fallen, the balance shifted back. He tilted his head slightly, a faint smile curving his lips, not a triumph of quiet acknowledgement. The crowd couldn't hold back their reaction. A low murmur spread through the diner, voices hushed but awed. "Did you see that?" Never touched a thing. Straight through, like he knew the room better than anyone here. The weight of those whispers was different now. They weren't filled with pity or unease. They carried respect, wonder, the kind of tone reserved for something remarkable. The bikers shifted uncomfortably, their mockery choked by the simple display of discipline they couldn't match. Their laughter, once so loud, had shrunk to little more than forced chuckles that sounded weak in comparison to the murmurs rising around them. They had wanted a reaction, something clumsy or humiliating, but what they got was a demonstration of strength disguised as obedience. Ethan rested the cane against the counter, brushing his hand once more against Valor's head in silent thanks. The dog eased back into position at his feet, calm as ever, his breathing even, his eyes steady. For him, it had been nothing more than a command followed, a task completed. But for the room, it was something far greater. The regulars leaned closer to one another, their whispers carrying the same message over and over. This was a man defined by blindness. This wasn't a dog defined by tricks. This was a partnership that surpassed mockery, a bond so strong it could not be shaken by laughter or cruelty. The cane that had once been a symbol of weakness had become, in the space of a few breaths, a symbol of control. And though the bikers still sat there, trying to hold their ground, they could feel the balance slipping further. The room no longer leaned their way. It leaned toward the quiet man at the counter and the dog who moved through the world as if he owned it. The diner's air had grown heavier, charged with something no one could quite name. Valor had returned Ethan's cane with such flawless precision that the entire room had been left in silence, broken only by the murmur of all threading to the townsfolk. The bikers, who had been so loud, so sure of themselves, tried to laugh again, to reclaim the stage they had dominated only minutes earlier. But the sound was no longer the same. Their voices were too loud, too sharp, the edges betraying what their faces could not hide. Unease. Rex slapped the table with the flat of his hand, barking out a laugh that felt almost desperate. "All that for a stick," he jeered, shaking his head. "You'd think he just solved world hunger." The others chuckled in response, but their eyes betrayed them. They flicked to Valor, then backed down at their plates, unable to hold the dog's gaze for more than a second. It wasn't the laugh of men amused. It was a laugh of men trying to keep something inside from slipping out. One of them, the wiry man with the snake tattoo curling around his neck, muttered, "Never seen anything like that." He said it low, almost to himself, but his neighbor heard and quickly elbowed him, forcing a grin onto his face. "Yeah, just a parlor trick," the neighbor added loudly, trying to cover the slip. Still, the comment had landed, and the air shifted further. Valor lay calm again at Ethan's feet, but the calmness itself unsettled him. The way he ignored scraps, the way he obeyed only when commanded, the way he had woven through a room crowded with chairs without once faltering. It was too much, too controlled. Dogs weren't supposed to act like that, not the men who only knew animals as creatures driven by instinct. To see one act with such precision was like staring at something uncanny. Ethan sat tall at the counter, silent, sipping his coffee as though he were unaware of the unease rolling through the room. But he could hear it. He could feel it. The laughter was breaking, splintering under the weight of something it couldn't drown out, and the silence of the town pressed against it, exposing every crack. The bikers grew restless. Rex leaned back in his chair, forcing a smirk, but his eyes narrowed at the German shepherd, studying him like a problem he couldn't solve. Another fiddle with the edge of his leather vest, tapping his foot against the tile in a rhythm too quick to be casual. Their movements betrayed them. They were losing control of the room, and they knew it. The townsfolk whispered, their voices low but audible in the brittle quiet. Never seen discipline like that. Not a sound, not a twitch. That's more than training. That's something else. The bikers heard those whispers too, and each one landed like a pebble in their shoes, small but impossible to ignore. When Valor lifted his head again, eyes scanning the men at the booth, the laughter stuttered and died altogether. His gaze didn't hold malice, didn't carry threat in the way of bared teeth or growls. It was steady, deliberate, intelligent. That was what made it worse. It wasn't an animal watching them. It was something more, something that understood, the kind of understanding that could not be mocked away. Rex shifted, clearing his throat, and forced another laugh, but it rang hollow. "See? He's just a dog," he muttered, his voice tight. Yet even he couldn't look directly into those eyes for long. The townsfolk saw it, the way his bravado slipped each time Valor turned his gaze. And they saw Ethan, blind but composed, sitting with a kind of stillness that turned mockery into noise without substance. The room belonged to neither the bikers nor the townsfolk anymore. It belonged to the man and his dog, their silence, precision reshaping every corner of the diner. And though the bikers tried to carry on, their laughter was nothing more than a shadow of what had been, frayed at the edges, eaten away by unease that they couldn't name, but everyone else could see. The laughter had dwindled to fragments, a brittle noise that failed to mask the unease creeping into the room. The townsfolk had stopped pretending to eat. Forks rested against plates, coffee cooled in untouched cups, and the whispers had given way to a silence so taut it seemed ready to snap. Even the jukebox in the corner, humming a faint old tune, felt like an intrusion on the stillness. Rex felt it most of all. He could sense the power slipping away, draining from his grasp with every second Ethan sat calmly at the counter and Valor refused to break his discipline. He had walked into this diner, expecting to dominate, to humiliate, to be the center of noise. Instead, he had been made small by silence, his laughter drowned by whispers of respect directed at someone else. His jaw tightened. He slammed his palm against the counter beside Ethan, the sharp crack cutting through the quiet like a gunshot. Cups rattled on their saucers. A spoon jumped and clattered against porcelain. The sudden violence of the sound made several of the townsfolk flinch. A woman near the back gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Rex leaned in close, his breath thick with smoke and whiskey, his voice raised in a roar that was part fury, part desperation. "You think you're better than me? You sit here all high and mighty, hiding behind that mutt, acting like you've won something." The outburst echoed against the walls, filling the room with a new kind of tension. But it wasn't Rex who owned it. It was Valor. The German shepherd surged upward from his place at Ethan's feet, his body snapping into a protective stance with precision that startled even those who had seen him move before. His chest rose high, his shoulders squared, and his frame angled squarely between Ethan and the man leaning over him. His gaze fixed on Rex with ferocity that burned, eyes narrowing, ears thrust forward, every line of his body vibrating with warning. He didn't lunge. He didn't bark. But the restraint itself was more terrifying than any explosion of sound. Rex faltered just for a breath, his bravado flickering as those eyes locked him in place. There was no mistaking what he saw there. It wasn't the gaze of a pet. It was the gaze of a soldier, honed and sharpened through fire, one who needed no words to declare intent. The silence between them was a blade, cutting deep into Rex's performance. Ethan moved his hand slowly, resting on Valor's back, steady as stone. His face turned toward Rex, calm but unyielding. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Step back," he said, the words low but carrying through the diner with a weight that silenced even the men at the booth. For a moment, no one moved. The entire diner seemed suspended, caught in the space between Valor's warning and Rex's next choice. The townsfolk watched with wide eyes, their breaths shallow, their hands clenched against tables as though holding themselves in place. Rex's crew shifted uneasily, their laughter stilled, their gazes darting between their leader and the animal standing like a wall of living power. Rex forced a grin, though it sat poorly on his face. "What, you gonna sick him on me?" "That it." His words were loud, but the strain in them was clear. He straightened his shoulders, but he did not lean closer this time. His hand, which had slammed so boldly against the counter, curled slightly at his side, as though he felt the weight of those eyes pressing into his skin. Valor didn't move, but the strength of his stillness carried more threat than any snarl could. His body was alive with readiness, his tail stiff, his legs braced, his breathing slow but heavy. To the townsfolk, it was unmistakable. The dog wasn't bluffing. If Ethan gave the word, the moment would end in a heartbeat, and everyone knew it. The silence returned, thicker than before, broken only by the faint hum of the lights overhead. Rex's words hung useless in the air, his attempt at intimidation exposed for what it was. Frustration, fear, and the knowledge that he no longer controlled the room. It belonged to the blind man and the dog who guarded him, and nothing he could do would take it back. The moment stretched, the diner thick with silence, the biker's bravado worn thin. Rex stood over Ethan, still fuming, still trying to find a foothold in the shifting tide, but the weight of Valor's steady eyes had hollowed his threats. The German shepherd remained planted, a barrier of flesh and will, his body taut with readiness. Every person in the room felt the balance of power had changed, though no one yet knew how far it would go. Then Ethan moved, just slightly, his head tilting as if listening to something only he could hear. His lips parted, and a single word slipped out, a word not meant for the room, not for the bikers, not even for the crowd of townsfolk holding their breath. It was a word carried from another life, a fragment of military code, simple and precise. Valor responded like lightning. The stillness that had gripped his body snapped into motion, but it wasn't chaos. It wasn't the reckless surge of an animal pushed past control. It was controlled, deliberate, every motion calculated. The dog stepped forward, his body brushing against Ethan's leg, guiding him away from the counter in a swift, fluid pivot. Ethan rose with him, cane in one hand, his other resting on Valor's harness, and together they began to move with uncanny speed. The crowd gasped softly as they watched man and dog weave across the floor. Tables, chairs, the scattered scraps of food. The obstacles didn't matter. Valor's body angled Ethan with such precision that he glided to the narrow gaps as though the room had been cleared for him. Where one misstep could have sent him stumbling, the German shepherd adjusted with invisible cues, shifting just enough to pull Ethan clear. It was seamless, like a dance rehearsed countless times, yet carried out with the urgency of the moment. Rex reacted instinctively, stepping into their path, trying to corner them as they moved. His boots slammed against the tile, his broad frame blocking the way, His arms spread as though to cage Ethan in. The bikers at the booth hooted, thinking their leader had regained control. But before Rex could even close the gap, Valor shifted course, pulling Ethan just enough to angle him past the obstacle. The movement was so fast, so precise, that Ethan slid clear of Rex's reach without breaking stride. Rex swore under his breath, his hand grasping at empty air where he thought he'd have the advantage. The townsfolk murmured in awe, their whispers spilling like a tide. "Did you see that?" It's like the dog knew before the man even moved. He's not just leading him, he's protecting him. Every voice carried a mixture of disbelief and respect, and he only deepened as Ethan and Valor continued their maneuver. Rex lunged again, tried to cut them off near the end of the counter. This time he was quicker, his anger fueling him, but Valor was quicker still. The shepherd pressed hard against Ethan's leg, spinning him just enough that the blind man slid behind a chair at the exact moment Rex's boot scraped past. It wasn't force that turned the tide, it was precision. The kind of precision that came from years of training, from countless drills where life and death depended on movements made in silence. Ethan never raised his voice. He didn't shout commands or bark orders. He simply walked with his dog, lips barely moving, each quiet word a signal that carried all the weight of memory of battlefields and bonds forged under fire. And Valor responded with the same unwavering obedience he had shown in combat, his body an extension of Ethan's will, his movements a shield sharper than any weapon. The bikers, once roaring with laughter, now fell quiet, their noise strangled by the spectacle. They had thought the man was defenseless, had mistaken silence for weakness. But what they saw now unsettled them. This wasn't weakness. This was strength born of discipline they couldn't fathom, a strength that made their noise look like bluster. Rex slowed, his fury warring with hesitation, his eyes darting between Ethan and the dog that had outmaneuvered him twice in a matter of seconds. The regulars saw it too, the falter in his step, the uncertainty creeping into his face. They realized what Rex was only beginning to understand. The blind man was never cornered, not with Valor at his side. When Ethan finally came to a stop, guided smoothly into open space near the center of the diner, the silence deepened. Valor's chest heaved steadily, his eyes still locked on Rex, his stance unyielding. Ethan lifted his chin, his expression calm, his hands steady on the harness. He hadn't stumbled. He hadn't faltered. What the bikers had tried to paint as weakness had revealed itself as something far more dangerous: mastery. The townsfolk stared, their awe spilling into reverence, and the bikers, who had once laughed so easily, now shifted in their seats, their bravado slipping like sand through their fingers. For the first time since they entered, it was clear. Ethan and Valor weren't the ones being tested. Rex and his men were, and already they were failing. The moment after Ethan gave the coded word lingered in the air, the crowd still reeling from the sudden shift they had witnessed. Rex had tried to box him in, but Valor had moved with uncanny speed, guiding Ethan clear with precision that defied belief. Now the shepherd pressed forward again, the muscles beneath his coat alive with power and control, his body angled to steer Ethan to the cramped maze of chairs, tables, and gawking townsfolk. It was no longer the slow, steady walk of a service dog. This was something else, something sharper, harder, carried from another life. Every motion Valor made had purpose. When Ethan's cane might clip the leg of the chair, Valor nudged his master's body subtly aside, the shift so natural it looked rehearsed. When a waitress froze mid-step with a tray in her hands, Valor curved Ethan around her in a wide arc without breaking stride. His pace was brisk, deliberate, not letting Ethan linger in the center of the storm. It was hurting, but not the clumsy guidance of instinct. This was tactical, combat-level precision, a practice maneuver to keep his charge safe no matter the terrain. The bikers, who only moments ago had dominated the room with their swagger, found themselves caught in the spectacle. Rex swore under his breath, trying to step into Ethan's path again, but Valor shifted just enough to keep the blind man a step beyond his reach. Another biker stood too close to a chair, smirking as if he would block them, but Valor cut Ethan sharply left, threading him through a narrow gap that forced a man to stumble back. The German shepherd's movements were so smooth that Ethan looked less like he was being led and more like he was gliding, as if he already knew the path lay before him. The effect on the bikers was immediate. Their confidence, once built on laughter and noise, crumbled under the silent pressure precision they couldn't match. One leaned back against the booth, his grin faltering as Valor's eyes cut toward him. Another shifted his feet, clearing space instinctively as a man and his dog drew closer. They were retreating, not with the bravado of a strategic withdrawal, but with the instinctive unease of men confronted with something they didn't understand. The townsfolk saw it clearly. They had watched the bikers throw food, shove shoulders, mock blindness, and laugh at silence. But now they were watching those same men recoil under the weight of discipline embodied in an animal's movements. Whispered all spread to the diner again, words like military and trained for war carried from table to table. To them, Valor's actions no longer looked like obedience alone. It looked like survival, sharpened into skill. Ethan remained calm, his expression composed, his hands steady on the harness. He gave no outward sign of command beyond the faintest tilt of his head and the quiet confidence in his posture. The partnership between man and dog was so complete that it was difficult to tell where Ethan ended and Valor began. Together, they moved as one, cutting through the diner's tension like a blade. Rex tried once more, slamming his boot against the floor as if to intimidate, but even he couldn't disguise the step he took backward when Valor turned to face him head-on. The shepherd's body curved protectively in front of Ethan, his gaze unflinching, his stance low and steady. The message was unmistakable. One more move, and the dog would not hesitate. The room was no longer the biker's stage. The balance had shifted fully. The noise of their laughter had withered into silence, their dominance drowned beneath the awe of a blind man guided by a dog whose training exceeded anything they could mock. They had come to provoke weakness, but what they saw instead unsettled them to their core. Valor's movements were not just impressive. They were undeniable proof of control, strength, of a bond forged in trials they could never imagine. By the time Ethan and Valor reached open space near the door, the bikers weren't closing in anymore. They were giving way, their eyes darting, their postures shrinking, their bravado leaking out into the quiet that now belonged entirely to someone else. The townsfolk saw it and knew. The ones who had swaggered in, loud and unchallenged, were now the ones backing away. And the man they thought to ridicule had never once needed to raise his voice. The diner was hushed, its walls heavy with the weight of what everyone had just seen. Chairs stood crooked where men had shifted back instinctively, their boots scuffing the tile as Valor cut his way through maze with Ethan in tow. The German shepherd had settled once more at his master's side, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, eyes unblinking as they swept the room. The biker's noise had collapsed into uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional forced chuckle that fooled no one. The townsfolk, though, were whispering, and in their voices carried something that had not been there before: recognition. Maya leaned closer to the farmer's wife at the corner booth, her voice low, but clear enough for others nearby to catch. "That's not just a service dog," she said, her eyes never leaving the shepherd. "That's Valor. He's not just trained to guide, he's decorated. Military K9, combat missions." The woman's eyes widened, and she pressed her hand to her lips. "Decorated," she breathed. The word passed quickly from one table to the next, carried in murmurs that grew like a rising tide. Soon the whole room was alive with whispers. A military dog? Overseas? Dangerous missions, like the ones you read about? Each voice added to the ripple until the biker's presence seemed smaller, thinner, swallowed by the truth spreading around them. The old man in the back, who had first muttered recognition earlier, lifted his head and confirmed it with a slow nod. "I've seen him," he said, not loud but steady. "News footage years ago. They ran a piece about a K9 unit that saved a squad from an ambush. That dog looks the same, moves the same." His words gave the whispers weight, shifting them from rumor to something solid. Maya's own memories pressed against her. She had been there, in uniform, in another life. She remembered Ethan, back when his voice carried authority in the field, and she remembered the dog that never left his side even in chaos. She had seen Valor slip into bombed-out alleys, nose low, body rigid, signaling danger before men even knew they were walking toward it. She had seen him take shrapnel and still drag a wounded soldier clear fire. To her, this wasn't rumor. It was truth. Her voice carried again, this time with the tone of someone who had lived it. He's not just trained to guide. He's trained to fight, to protect. Ethan wasn't giving him his charity. They served together. They bled together. That statement landed harder than the bikers' laughter ever had. The townsfolk shifted, eyes settling on Ethan with something different now. Not pity, not discomfort, but reverence. They saw the blind man not as diminished, but as someone who had endured the unendurable and stood tall in its aftermath. And they saw the dog not as a helper, but as a soldier in his own right, one whose presence carried the weight of survival. The bikers tried to laugh again, one of them forcing a jeer about fairy tales and hero dogs, but even their voices trembled with cracks. The crowd wasn't listening anymore. The atmosphere had turned. Every whisper now layered into something unshakable: respect. The townsfolk straightened in their seats, their silence no longer passive but protective, as if they too had stepped behind Ethan and his dog. Ethan sat at the counter, expression calm, his hand resting on Valor's head. He didn't need to say anything. He let the room speak for him, let the truth spread through whispers that grew stronger with each retelling. He had never asked for recognition, never sought to turn his past into a weapon, but here it was, reshaping the space around him. And in that moment, the bikers realized what they had walked into was far greater than a man and his service animal. They had stumbled into a legacy, one that carried more weight than their noise could ever drown. The diner belonged to that legacy now, and they, for all their sneers and laughter, were outsiders to it. The shift was complete. The man they had mocked now sat at the heart of the room, untouchable, guarded not just by his dog, but by the truth that had finally been spoken aloud. The whispers of recognition still hung in the diner, heavier now than any of the bikers' noise. It was no longer just rumor. It had become accepted truth, etched into the atmosphere. The blind man was no helpless figure to be mocked, and the dog at his feet was no pet to be baited. Together, they were something far more dangerous, and the townsfolk's silence had shifted into quiet respect. Rex felt that change as clearly as the weight of his own jacket pressing against his shoulders. He could feel control slipping from him, could see the way his men's eyes darted uneasily toward the door. That knowledge burned. He couldn't let it stand. His pride demanded a response. Something to prove that he wasn't shaken, that he wasn't about to be outdone by whispers and the steady presence of a blind veteran and his animal. His chair scraped harshly against the tile as he stood, the noise slicing through the silence. Boots pounding. He closed the space between himself and Ethan with a kind of swagger meant to mask desperation. The townsfolk stiffened. A man at the counter half rose from his stool before his wife pulled him back down, whispering frantically. Maya gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles whitening, but she didn't move. Everyone in the room seemed to understand that this moment wasn't theirs to interrupt. Rex leaned in, his shadow falling across Ethan, his hand reaching forward as though to grip his shoulder again, to force him into reacting. The words on his lips dripped with arrogance. "What are you without that dog, huh? Just a blind man sitting in the dark. You think you scare me?" The answer came not from Ethan, but from the dog. Valor's body shifted, rising slightly, weight balanced forward. Then came the sound, low at first, like a vibration rolling up from the earth itself. It was not the wild, uncontrolled growl of an animal threatened. It was measured, deliberate, resonant. The kind of sound that carried experience, that spoke of commands given and followed in places where silence could mean death. It was a growl of a soldier, deep and practiced, honed through years of battlefield readiness. The sound froze Rex mid-motion. His hand hovered just inches from Ethan, fingers stiff, the bravado in his eyes faltering as the growl wrapped around him. His chest rose unevenly, his jaw clenching as though he wanted to laugh it off. But the sound pinned him where he stood. It wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. Ethan sat unmoving, his face calm, his hand resting gently on Valor's back. He didn't need to say anything. The growl spoke louder than words, a reminder that his silence was not emptiness but command, that the dog's restraint was not weakness but discipline. Every person in the diner felt the hair rise on their arms, the instinctive response to a predator's warning. And yet they also knew this was no predator losing control. This was a soldier holding the line. The bikers at the booth shifted uncomfortably, their laughter long gone. One muttered something under his breath, too low to catch, and another fiddled with a chain around his neck, his eyes avoiding Valor altogether. For the first time, their noise had no room to grow. Rex tried to move, to prove he wasn't afraid, but the weight of the sound pressed harder. The growl deepened, steady and unbroken, vibrating against the walls until the entire room seemed to hum with it. Finally, Rex pulled his hand back, disguising retreat with a sneer. "Just a dog," he spat, though the quiver in his voice betrayed him. The townsfolk knew better. They had heard the difference. They had felt the practiced authority in that sound, the years of discipline echoing from a battlefield most of them could only imagine. To them, the growl was not just a threat to Rex. It was proof of what Valor was and what Ethan carried with him. When the sound faded, the silence it left behind was even heavier. Valor lowered himself again, his breathing steady, his eyes never leaving Rex. Ethan lifted his coffee cup with calm precision, as though nothing had happened at all. But something had happened. The test had been made, and the fear, though denied aloud, was plain in Rex's eyes. And for the first time, the bikers understood that their laughter could never reclaim the room. The blind man and his dog had already taken it. The growl faded into silence, leaving only the hum of the diner's lights and the uneasy shifting of boots against tile. Rex had drawn back, hand hovering in the air a moment too long, before dropping it with a sneer that didn't quite reach his eyes. The men and his crew sat restless in their booth, their forced grins thinning as they tried to find their voices again. But the laughter wouldn't come. Valor's warning had stripped the room bare, leaving only tension and the sound of nervous breathing. It was then that Ethan moved, not with the suddenness of a man rising to fight, but with the steady poise of someone who knew he didn't need to. He adjusted his stool slightly, lifting his chin as if the act alone reclaimed the space around him. His hand rested lightly on Valor's back, but his face turned toward the men who had mocked him. And then, for the first time since they had followed him into the diner, he spoke. "You," he said evenly, his voice calm, steady, filling the room without ever rising. His head tilted slightly to the left, where the wiry biker with the snake tattoo Saturday, boots tapping too fast. "You've been restless since you walked in, trying to convince yourself you're not nervous, but your foot hasn't stopped." The man froze. His heel, which had been bouncing unconsciously against the floor, went still in an instant. A few of the townsfolk turned their heads toward him, their eyes wide, murmurs running low. Ethan turned his face slightly forward, his words measured, unhurried. "And you," he continued, directing his focus toward another. "Leather creaks every time you shift. You can't sit still, because you're trying to look bigger than you are. But every time Valor looks your way, you lean back just enough to give yourself away." The biker he addressed shifted again, as though caught in the act, his smirk faltering. The whispers in the diner grew louder, all threading through them. Ethan's tone never sharpened, never rose to mockery or anger. He spoke with the calm of someone who had nothing to prove. "The one near the jukebox. Your breaths are uneven. You laugh loud, but when the room goes quiet, you're the first to exhale like you've been holding it in. Fear sounds different from laughter. It's heavier." The man at the jukebox muttered a curse under his breath, adjusting his stance. But the truth of Ethan's words lingered. Everyone could hear it now. The nervous breaths, the shuffling boots, the strain in their movements. The blind man had mapped the entire room in sound, in rhythm, in the things no eyes were needed to see. Ethan leaned back slightly, his face composed, his voice still steady. "And you, Rex." He didn't need to point. The name itself drew every gaze to the man who had led the mockery. Your hand shook when you pulled it back from the counter. You hide it in your laugh, in your words, but you gave it away. You're not fearless. You're just loud. The room fell utterly silent. Rex's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He couldn't. The blind man had seen him more clearly than anyone else in the room, had stripped away the noise to expose what was left underneath. Ethan let the words hang, his composure unbroken. He had spoken without anger, without flourish, only truth carried in the cadence of a calm, measured voice. To the bikers, It was a revelation they hadn't expected, one they couldn't laugh away. To the townsfolk, it was proof of what they had already begun to sense. Blindness had taken Ethan's sight, but it had not taken his strength. He reached for his coffee again, lifting it with steady hands. Valor shifted slightly at his feet, his body relaxed but alert, his eyes still fixed on the men who had come in so certain of themselves. Ethan took a slow sip, set the cup down, and said nothing more. He didn't need to. The room already belonged to him. Rex had been silent too long. The calm voice of the blind man had cut deeper than any insult could, and the steady composure of the dog at his side had reduced the room's laughter to nothing. The townsfolk were no longer watching the bikers with fear, but with quiet judgment, their whispers heavy with respect for Ethan and Valor. That shift gnawed at Rex like a thorn under skin. He wasn't used to losing ground. Not in front of his men. Not in front of strangers. His pride demanded something reckless, and pride rarely knew when to stop. He stepped forward again, his boots striking the tile hard, each step louder than it needed to be. The men at his booth muttered nervously, half rising as if to pull him back, but they didn't dare interfere. The room held its breath, every eye following him as he closed the distance to the counter. His hand balled into a fist, not raised yet, but hanging heavy at his side, full of threat. Valor's head lifted instantly, his ears pricking, his body rising with smooth precision. His muscles coiled, his frame angling forward between Ethan and the man approaching. His eyes locked on Rex with a stare that no one else in the room could hold for long. Ethan felt the shift through the harness, the subtle tremor of readiness running under the surface. Rex sneered, leaning forward as though to test the wall of discipline standing in front of him. "What's he gonna do?" he jeered, his voice loud but breaking at the edges. "Scare me with a stare? He won't touch me." Ethan didn't flinch. His face was calm, his hand steady on the counter, his voice cutting through the room with one sharp word, a command carried from another life, the kind of word that didn't need to be loud to be absolute. Valor moved. The German shepherd lunged not with wildness, not with fury, but with surgical precision. His jaws closed around the leather sleeve of Rex's jacket, the grip firm but controlled. There was no tearing, no blood, no uncontrolled violence. Just strength, unyielding and deliberate, holding the biker where he stood. Rex's bravado cracked instantly, his arm yanked sideways as Valor stepped forward, pushing his massive weight against him. The crowd gasped, some half rising from their seats, but no one interfered. They could see it clearly. This was an attack. It was control. Valor's grip was unshakable, his eyes burning with warning, his body angled to drive Rex back. The biker stumbled, boots scraping against the tile as he tried to keep his balance. His crew muttered and cursed, half out of their seats, but not one of them dared to step closer. Rex tried to jerk free, but Valor's hold was steady, unrelenting. The shepherd forced him backward step by step, the leather creaking under the pressure, until his back hit the edge of the chair and he stumbled hard, nearly falling before catching himself. The gasps of the townsfolk filled the silence, their oar rising above the tension. Ethan didn't move. His hand remained on the counter, his face calm, his voice measured as he gave another command, short, clipped, final. Valor released instantly, stepping back with precision, his body lowering into readiness once more at Ethan's side. Not a shred of fabric was torn. Not a drop of blood was drawn. The point had been made without excess. The diner was silent except for the heavy breaths of Rex, his chest heaving as he tried to recover his pride. His men stared at him with wide eyes, their confidence unraveling with every second. The townsfolk saw it too, and in their silence grew something greater than fear, certainty. The blind man had never been at risk. The dog had never lost control. Together, they had proven what the bikers couldn't understand: discipline, command, and strength that required no violence to dominate. Rex pulled his sleeve back quickly, hiding the tremor in his hand. He tried to laugh, but the sound rang hollow, carrying no weight in a room that no longer belonged to him. The people in the diner weren't laughing with him anymore. They were watching Ethan and Valor, their respect etched into the quiet. Ethan reached down once more, brushing his fingers across Valor's head, his touch calm and steady. The message was clear. The demonstration was over. The blind man and his dog had reclaimed the room, and the bikers had been pushed as far as they would go. They were no longer predators here. They were intruders standing in a place that was no longer theirs. For a long moment after Valor released Rex's sleeve, the diner was silent. The air seemed to hold its breath, the tension too thick for words. Rex stood rigid, his chest heaving, his face flushed with more than anger. His hand shook at his side, the mark of fear he tried to hide beneath a sneer. His men saw it. The townsfolk saw it. Everyone knew what it meant. The power they had swaggered in was gone, stripped away by a single command and a dog's steady grip. The quiet pressed heavier than any noise. Then one of the bikers shoved himself out booth, his chair screeching across the tile before clattering to the ground. The sound broke the stillness like a crack of lightning. His curse came out too loud, too sharp, his bravado unraveling. "We're done here," he muttered, his voice shaking as he moved toward the door. Another followed quickly, his boots stumbling against a table leg, nearly toppling it in his haste. The rest moved with less grace, their tough postures collapsing into frantic energy. One tripped over his own chair as he tried to stand, sending it skidding into the counter with a bang that made a waitress flinch. Another slammed his hand against the jukebox as though to cover his retreat with noise, but the act was hollow, the sound brittle. Their laughter, once so loud, had died completely, replaced by mutters, curses, and the scraping of chairs as they tried to escape the room they no longer owned. Rex lingered just a heartbeat longer, as though clinging to the last scrap of pride. His eyes darted from Ethan to Valor, and for the first time since stepping into the diner, he had nothing to say. No jeer, no laugh, no sneer sharp enough to disguise the truth. His crew was already spilling toward the door, their retreat too clumsy to be disguised as swagger. Finally, Rex turned, muttering something unintelligible, and followed them out. His exit wasn't smooth. It was hurried, shoulders brushing against the doorframe as he shoved into the street. The townsfolk watched in silence as the gang collapsed into chaos outside. Boots pounded against pavement. Curses echoed into the square, and the roar of engines soon followed as they scrambled for their bikes. Some dropped helmets, fumbling to scoop them up. One nearly tipped his motorcycle in his rush to climb on, drawing a bark of frustrated laughter from his own comrade. The sound wasn't a laughter of confidence. It was a laughter of fear cracking under its own weight. Inside, the diner remained still. No one moved until the roar of engines filled the air, the bikers peeling away in a desperate rush, their noise scattering into the distance like a storm breaking apart. The glass windows rattled faintly from the force of their departure. And then, at last, the silence returned. Chairs lay toppled across the floor, plates sat abandoned with half-eaten meals, and the smell of grease and coffee hung heavy in the aftermath. But the fear that had weighed on the room when the bikers first entered was gone. In its place was something steadier. Relief. Respect. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed, when everyone realizes they have witnessed something they will never forget. Ethan sat calmly at the counter, his hand resting on Valor's back, his face as composed as it had been from the start. He hadn't risen, hadn't shouted, hadn't needed to. The dog lay once more at his feet, his chest rising in steady rhythm, his gaze still fixed on the door, as if making certain the threat was truly gone. The people in the diner looked at Ethan differently now. The whispers began again, softer than before, carrying not all this time but reverence. They spoke of Valor's discipline, of Ethan's calm, of the way fear had folded in on itself until the men who brought it had fled. What had started as mockery had ended in retreat, and every person in that diner knew they would remember the sight for years. The bikers had come in loud, their laughter filling the air, but they had left in chaos, running from a silence they couldn't break, a silence guarded by a blind man and his dog. The engines of the bikes faded into the distance, their thunder swallowed by the stillness that rushed back in to fill the diner. Chairs remained toppled, plates sat cold, and the smell of spilt coffee mingled with fried bacon and grease. But the tension that had clung to the room was gone, carried away with the retreat of the men who had once filled it with noise. What replaced it was not applause, not cheers, but something heavier, silence. A silence, so complete it seemed the air itself was holding its breath, stunned by what it had just witnessed. Ethan sat at the counter, composed as ever, his posture straight, one hand resting lightly on his cane, the other on Valor's back. He didn't turn toward the crowd, didn't acknowledge the way every set of eyes in the diner now seemed fixed on him. His stillness was the same as it had been when the bikers mocked, when a cane was knocked to the floor, when insults were spat in his direction. The only difference was the way the room saw it now. Where before silence had seemed like vulnerability, now it looked like strength, unshakable, immovable. Valor lay at his feet, his breathing even, his eyes still on the door though the threat had long since passed. The dog hadn't barked once, hadn't lashed out, hadn't lost control. His restraint was what lingered most in the minds of the onlookers. They had seen animals defend themselves before, had heard stories of loyal dogs snapping at intruders, but this was something different. Valor's control was sharper than aggression. It was the discipline of a soldier, the precision of training that spoke of a bond deeper than utility. He was not simply a guide. He was a guardian, a partner, a presence that altered the air in the room. The townsfolk sat frozen, their eyes tracing back and forth between Ethan and Valor. Some whispered, but the whispers carried a new tone. They weren't trading gossip now. They were naming what they had seen, try to put into words something that had cut through more deeply than spectacle. One man murmured that he had never seen discipline like that. Another spoke of courage without needing to say the word itself. A woman near the back clasped her hands tightly, as though in prayer, her eyes fixed on Ethan with quiet reverence. Maya stood behind the counter, the rag she had grabbed earlier still clutched in her hand. She didn't move to clean the spilled coffee, didn't rush to reset the room. Instead, she simply stared at the man she had once known in another life. She had seen him steady soldiers under fire, had heard his voice cut through panic with the same calm certainty he had used tonight. But to see him here in their quiet town, facing mockery and cruelty with that same composure, it struck her differently. The war had not left him behind. It lived in him, not as a wound, but as a strength that commanded even now. The silence stretched on until it became the only answer the town could give. No one clapped. No one cheered. Applause would have cheapened it, reduced what unfolded to entertainment. This was not entertainment. It was witness. It was recognition. The people in the diner had seen strength that did not shout, power that did not humiliate, courage that did not need spectacle. And it had changed them. Some would walk out later into the cool night air and tell the story in hushed tones. Others would carry it quietly, a memory they wouldn't share but would never forget. But all of them knew the same thing. The room they had entered that morning was not the same room they were leaving. Something had shifted, not just in how they saw Ethan, but in how they saw silence, discipline, and the quiet dignity that could turn noise into nothing. Ethan remained still, his face unreadable, listening to the sound of people gathering themselves, forks scraping plates again, chairs being lifted from the floor. Valor shifted slightly, lowering his head onto his paws, but his eyes remained open, watchful. The storm had passed, but the impression it left would remain. The town was transformed, not with spectacle, not with noise, but with a kind of moment that sank deep into the bones. And though no one spoke aloud, they all understood. They had not merely watched a man and his dog stand against mockery. They had witnessed something far rarer, the quiet strength that reshapes the measure of fear, dignity, and respect. The diner was slowly stirring back to life, though the rhythm was different now. Chairs were righted with careful hands. Voices remained hushed, and no one dared to speak too loudly, as if raising their voice might break the fragile weight of what had just unfolded. The bikers' laughter, once a roar that filled the space, had vanished into memory, leaving behind only the soft clinks of silverware and the whisper of cautious conversations. At the counter, Ethan sat steady, his face composed, his hand resting lightly on Valor's head. The German shepherd lay stretched at his feet, his body still taut with vigilance though the threat had passed, his eyes fixed on the door as though unwilling to trust the quiet. Maya moved behind the counter with deliberate slowness, her hands trembling only slightly as she gathered a clean cup and poured fresh coffee. She had been silent through it all, her eyes locked on Ethan, watching him command the room without raising his voice, without lifting a hand. She remembered him as he had been years ago, his voice steady in chaos, his presence unshaken even when everything around him burned. To her, what had happened tonight was not a surprise. But to see it here, in a diner on Main Street, in front of neighbors and strangers who had never known that side of him, made the memory strike sharper. She placed the cup gently before him, setting it in the exact spot where his hand would find it. The warmth of the coffee curled faint tendrils of steam into the heavy air. For a moment, she stood still, her fingers lingering near the cup as though anchoring herself there. Her eyes drifted down to Valor, meeting the dog's unblinking gaze. His composure unsettled her as much as it inspired her. It wasn't just training. It wasn't just loyalty. It was the weight of a soldier's work carried in the body of a dog who had seen more than anyone in this town ever would. "They'll never laugh at you again," Maya said softly. The words were almost a whisper, but in the silence of the diner, they carried clearly. Her voice wasn't fierce, wasn't triumphant. It was weary, certain, laced with the knowledge of someone who understood what it meant to be dismissed and then seen too late. Ethan's hand found the cup, his fingers curling around the handle with practiced ease. He did not smile, but he tilted his head slightly in her direction, the faintest acknowledgement of her words. His calm remained unbroken, as if nothing had happened, as if the eruption of chaos and the sudden retreat had been just another passing moment in a long line of battles. But Valor lifted his head at her voice, his ears flicking once, his gaze shifting from the door to her face. For the briefest instant, it was as if the dog understood the weight of what she had said. Around them, the townsfolk absorbed her words in silence. Some nodded faintly. Some looked down at their plates. Others glanced at Ethan with new eyes. No one contradicted her. They knew she was right. What had once been a man to mock had revealed itself as something unshakable. Laughter had been silenced not by force, but by dignity, and that kind of silence would linger far longer than noise. Maya stepped back slowly, her hands clasped before her, but her eyes stayed on Valor. She remembered the dog in another place, remembered the weight he had carried then, and saw it mirrored in him now. To her, he was more than proof of Ethan's survival. He was proof of their bond, of battles fought side by side, of trust that could not be shaken by cruelty or mockery. And she knew, as did everyone in that room, that those who had laughed tonight would think twice before ever daring again. Ethan lifted the cup to his lips, taking a slow sip, his movements calm and unhurried. Valor lowered his head once more, his eyes closing briefly but his ears still alert. The storm had passed, but the impression of it remained carved into the air, and Maya's words lingered with it, quiet but final, sealing what the entire town already understood. The days of mocking silence were over. Respect had taken their place. The storm had passed, and the diner was settling into its new silence. Chairs were slowly lifted upright. Plates shifted back into place, but no one spoke louder than a murmur. The energy had changed, reshaped by what they had all witnessed. Ethan sat at the counter as he had from the beginning, composed, steady, his hand resting lightly on his cane. And at his feet lay Valor, calm once more, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The German shepherd stretched his body along the cool tile, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. His eyes, which only moments before had burned with sharp, unwavering focus, now softened into a steady watchfulness. To those who looked at him, he seemed almost relaxed, a dog at rest. But there was no mistaking the readiness, still coiled beneath that stillness. Every muscle had returned to quiet, but not to weakness. To the townsfolk, the confrontation had been a spectacle, a story they would tell again and again with lowered voices. To the bikers, now long gone, it had been humiliation. But to Valor, it was none of these things. His actions carried no pride, no sense of victory. For him, there had only been a command, given in a voice he trusted beyond all others. He had answered it with precision, nothing more. Now that the command was over, he returned to rest, his breathing even, his body folding back into stillness, as though the chaos had never touched him. Ethan's hand drifted down to brush the top of his head. It wasn't a reward, not a gesture of triumph, just a quiet acknowledgement of a bond that needed no words. Valor didn't move under the touch, only flicked his ears once in recognition, his focus still fixed on the room around them. Even at rest, he was working. Every scrape of a chair, every cough, every shuffle of boots was measured, weighed, stored away in that steady mind. The regulars watched him with a mix of awe and disbelief. To them, a dog refusing food scraps was impressive. A dog guiding a blind man with such flawless precision was remarkable. But a dog facing down men twice his size with such control power, that was something else entirely. They whispered about it to each other, trading fragments of what they had seen, but their voices always dropped when they looked back at Valor, as though afraid to disturb the quiet dignity with which he now lay. Maya, still standing behind the counter, stared longest of all. She had seen him like this before, intense overseas, lying near Ethan's cot after a day of chaos, chest rising slowly, eyes half closed but never entirely asleep. She knew the look. It wasn't rest in the way ordinary people thought of it. It was vigilance wrapped in calm, the stillness of a soldier waiting for the next call. She knew that if Ethan spoke another command, even whispered, Valor would rise again without hesitation, ready to act. But Ethan didn't speak. He sat quietly, drinking his coffee, his posture calm, as if giving his partner the silence he had earned. Valor lay still at his feet, and to anyone who didn't understand, it might have seemed as though the dog was simply napping after a long day. But those who had watched carefully knew better. His rest wasn't escape, wasn't exhaustion. It was a natural rhythm of obedience. Act when called, return to calm when dismissed. The people in the diner carried the weight of what they had seen, but Valor carried nothing. He didn't question, didn't gloat, didn't dwell. For him, the world was simple. Ethan spoke, and he responded. The confrontation was already behind him. His breathing was steady, his posture loose, his eyes half closed but always aware. To him, nothing had changed, and that was what struck the townsfolk most. Where men had filled the room with chaos and fear, the dog had answered with precision. Where others trembled with pride or shame, Valor had returned to stillness as if it had all been routine. Because for him, this was not spectacle, not a story, not a moment to replay in his mind. It was obedience. It was trust. It was survival, lived out one command at a time. Ethan sat in silence. The dog had rested his feet, and the room understood. The strength they had witnessed wasn't something performed for them. It was simply the way these two lived. A blind man and his partner, moving through the world with discipline that needed no explanation. The diner, once loud with jeers and the scrape of boots, now hummed with a different kind of energy. The fear had drained away, replaced by a heavy silence that felt almost reverent. Plates sat cooling on tables, cups of coffee half finished, but no one moved to eat. All eyes lingered on the man at the counter and the dog lying calm at his feet, the pair who had shifted the balance of the room, without raising their voices or losing control. For a time, no one dared to break the quiet. Then, slowly, a farmer in a worn jacket rose from his seat. He was not a man known for gestures, but he stepped forward hat in hand, his boots scuffing the floor in deliberate steps. He stopped beside Ethan, extended his hand, and cleared his throat. "Sir," he said simply. His voice carried the weight of respect that needed no embellishment. Ethan turned his head slightly, locating the man by sound alone, and accepted the handshake with steady composure. The farmer gave a firm squeeze, then glanced down at Valor, his hand lowered, brushing the shepherd's ear. Valor lifted his head briefly, allowing the touch, then settled again, calm and steady. The farmer stepped back without another word, but his gesture was enough to unlock the room. One by one, others began to follow. A waitress, still clutching her apron nervously, approached with hesitant steps. She reached out, not to offer pity, but to place a hand gently on Ethan's arm. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes flicking to Valor before returning to the man she had once served coffee without thought. A young boy, emboldened by the shift in the room, slid from his seat and crouched down, his small hand scratching lightly behind Valor's ear. The dog didn't move, didn't react beyond a slow blink, but the boy's grin lit up his face as if he had touched something greater than himself. The truckers at the counter exchanged a glance before stepping forward as well. One offered his hand, the other a nod, each gesture carrying the kind of respect that men showed when words fell short. More hands came after that, men and women alike, townsfolk who had sat frozen in fear minutes before now drawn toward the quiet dignity they had witnessed. None of them spoke much. They didn't need to. Each handshake, each touch of Valor's fur, was a confession of what they now understood. They had been wrong to see weakness in silence. Ethan accepted each gesture with the same calm composure he had carried all along. He didn't smile, didn't bow his head, didn't play to the moment. He simply acknowledged them, his grip steady, his posture unshaken. Valor endured the touches with patience, his discipline unchanged, though there was a softness in his eyes as he accepted the townsfolk's hands. To the people who had watched him stare down mockery and provocation, the chance to lay a hand on him felt like touching a piece of something larger than themselves. When the last of them had stepped back, the room fell quiet again. Ethan rose from his stool, his cane in one hand, the other brushing lightly against Valor's harness. The dog stood smoothly, body taut but calm, ready as ever to guide. Together, they turned toward the door. No one blocked their path. No one jeered. No one whispered pity. Only the shuffle of respectful steps made way for them, the crowd parting without command. The bell above the diner door jingled softly as it opened, the sound delicate against the heavy silence. Ethan stepped out first, Valor leading him with precise confidence. The townsfolk stood where they were, watching in silence as the pair crossed the threshold. Not until the door swung shut behind them did the whispers begin again, low and reverent. They spoke of what they had seen, of the dog's discipline, of the blind man's strength, of the way noise had been silenced not with force, but with dignity. Out on Main Street, the air was cooler, the world quieter than the storm left behind. Ethan walked with the same calm stride he had carried from the beginning, Valor steady at his side. To them, it was nothing extraordinary, just another day, another moment of moving forward together. But behind them, the town was changed. Respect had taken root where mockery once stood, and the whispers left in their wake would linger long after they were gone. The man and his dog walked on, dignity intact, leaving only silence and awe behind them.